Welcome, everyone, to episode 98 of the Warhammer 40,000 podcast that goes by the identity of Look Out, Sir. My name is Dan, and it's that bit at the beginning of the show where I get to introduce my good buddy, Phil. How's it going, Philip?
It is I am here. The all-powerful mighty beard. I'm good, thank you.
I'm glad, mate. I'm glad that you're doing well. It's clear to tell from your, little jovial introduction there. I was curious what, particular type of situation you were channeling, I suppose, in that instance. I couldn't tell whether you were going for a callback to the floaty beard or whether you had come up with a whole new persona that you wanted to give birth to in this instance.
You gotta hark back to the floaty beard. He's the best one, basically.
It's true. Yeah. It's true. I don't know. I felt like your assortment of gas mask noises were pretty entertaining, as too was your orky bits and pieces. I mean, you've got a great many characters.
I've got a burgeoning voice acting career on the go. If anyone wants to hire me out to do some low rent animes, I can, dub over it in English for people, I guess.
There you go, mate. Putting it out there. Can you imagine that there is, potential there for us doing this podcast on the regular as we do to venture out into new forms of work where we get paid to do voiceovers? Could you imagine if, I managed to score some work doing like radio ads or some kind of like TV ad for, I don't know, like Quick Fit or something?
All those really annoying Spotify ads.
See, now, as a Spotify premium customer, I've never heard a Spotify ad in, like, forever time. Back when I did, it was just Nando's all the time. What do they advertise now on there?
Oh, I mean, all sorts. Quite often it's something like LinkedIn, and it's loads of different voice. It's a bit meta. It's like voiceover actors, like, applying for the job for the ad in the ad itself. I mean, that's
weird. Sophisticated advertising right there, man. I mean, that's some clever stuff. Hey, do you want to know a piece of advertising that I saw recently that I thought was genius?
Go on.
KFC opened their own hotel room in London.
It's a bit weird. Is it so you can just eat all the chicken?
It was in celebration of the staycation. They made a hotel room that had like a button that you could press that would bring you KFC chicken around the clock.
If it doesn't just drop from a small funnel in the ceiling, I'm going to be disappointed.
I don't know. Would you be overly thrilled to receive your chicken via a funnel?
No, I would. Very Willy Wonka style. Just hit a button. The chicken comes from the ceiling, just lands on the floor if you haven't put anything down. Yeah, goes everywhere. But that's sort of the thing I want. And the longer you hold it down for, the more the chicken comes out.
Well, exactly. Aren't you in any way concerned by how that chicken is going to be maintained? Because I suppose to do it in a, food hygiene safe way, they would need to consistently ensure that they've updated the chicken every every 30 minutes, because they can't leave chickens sitting in a pipe for hour upon hour. It's not safe for consumption.
No, I imagine it's sort of being in a oven kept warm somewhere, and then
but even then they could only keep it for like half an hour, mate.
Oh really? Is that?
Chicken's a very dangerous animal. You don't want to be mucking around with overcooked chicken, or undercooked chicken for that matter.
Maybe it's not really chicken. Maybe it's human meat grinder.
You want human bits coming out of a funnel for your consumption.
I'm just trying to bring it back to 40k and somehow. So
I'm with you.
Get back onto the actual topic of the episode.
Ah, good. Yes. No, I like what you've done there.
The corpse grinders from Necromunda. There we go. That's what they have. A button where human giblets come out.
I don't think you could advertise that as an especially appealing hotel option, though, could you? Come to the Corpse Grinder Hotel. Where,
I imagine in the world of the Underhive, people will eat whatever they can get their hands on.
Well, that's true. And I imagine a fair few inhabitants of the Underhive have unfortunately had to spend time in the Corpse Grinder Hotel, not necessarily at their own, their own behest, as it were. Just sort of found themselves there. Anyway, there you go. Much like the residents of the Corpse Grinder Hotel, we found ourselves in a predicament. Which is to say that we didn't know what we were going to talk about this episode, but we ended up talking about what, Phil?
Well, you know, we're never short of ideas. Let's be honest.
No, that's true.
But we ended up talking about maths, or if you're American, math, statistics, stats, predominantly stats, answering a community question, which is why is there so much 2+ in the game? Is it in terms of to hit, and why does that 2+ always get a reroll? So that was our main topic that we were looking at, and then we also decided to finally hit the nail on the head about why we don't, not necessarily say we don't like vehicles, but why we think the vehicle rules don't work, and potentially give some suggestions about how they could be improved for obviously all those Warhammer employees listening to our podcast that don't exist. But you know,
exactly, we are the fonts of knowledge. We know how to fix everything.
Fonts of knowledge. Are we Arial, or are we Comic Sans?
Oh no, I meant as in like, you know, like a faucet as such, a water vessel.
I thought, isn't it a fountain of knowledge?
Yeah, we are, but I think maybe that's an American version of it, isn't it? Because don't they have? Oh no, theirs is like faucets. We're faucets of knowledge.
Turn that tap on, and hope corpse starch doesn't come out of it.
Exactly. But before you get to that stage in your life, perhaps you might enjoy a 5. Sorry, this is a terrible transition, but anyway, a 5-star review.
Tasty.
Peter!
Oh, hello,
What are
Dad.
you doing in here, son?
Oh, I'm
What
just...
have I told you about wasting your time with these little plastic figurines?
It's not a waste of time, I like it.
How dare you talk back to me, Peter? It's about time you grew up.
I don't want to grow up. Oh, man, maybe there's something on the radio. Yeah, this is nicer.
Peter! Peter!
What's that?
That's right, it's me, the ghost of a award-winning TV and radio presenter, Jeremy Beadle.
Jeremy Beadle?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Now let me tell you here, Sonny, my dad was always telling me to grow up, and I never did. And look how successful I was. So ignore him, Peter, and keep playing with that little plastic crack. And while you're at it, listen to the Look Out Sir podcast, which right now is time for the 5-star review.
Wow, thanks, Jeremy.
Who are you talking to with there, son?
Jeremy Beadle.
What? No!
This week's 5-star review comes from where?
You're having a seizure. You okay?
No, I was trying to do like a sneeze.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it was sort of like a thing, but I went
it-
with a Phil.
Have we deviated off into the land of the Facebooks again?
No, we've actually gone back to, you know, our fertile homeland, which is, of course, Apple Podcasts of Great Britain, no less. It's been a long while.
Breton.
That's right. It's been a long road getting on back to here. Not to quote Star Trek Enterprise theme music. But this 5-star review comes by way of Apple Podcasts of Great Britain and is contributed by an individual by the name of The Capocalypse. Apocalypse with a C at the beginning, so I presume a capopolis, something along those lines. Would you hazard a guess at the pronunciation of such a thing, Phil?
Well, God, I can't do it. Capocalypse. It's an apocalypse of caps. He's got too many. And in fact, I know someone that has too many caps. They have a wall of caps, and that could well indeed be a capocalypse.
That could be. Is this caps as in the hats that you might wear upon your bonce, or perchance the the little caps that you get on bottles of fizzy pop?
No, definitely the head caps.
Fair enough. Anyway, well, there you go. You guys are lifesavers, 5 stars. Now, it's always an interesting scenario when you end up with a title like "We Are Lifesavers" to necessarily state that this podcast has the potential that saves lives is a quite terrifying prospect, if I'm honest with you, but also quite heartwarming and lovely. I haven't actually gotten into the meat of this thing yet, so I might be being a bit too unreasonable about this introduction, but I suppose it's nice to be considered a lifesaver, right, Phil?
I mean, I've got my first aid badge, so I'm a lifesaver of sorts.
Oh, nice, mate. Well, you did your lifesavers badge in the old swimming pools back in the day. You went down and got your brick.
No, I was thinking more beavers.
Oh, beavers
and cubs.
Beavers and Cubs. Well, you graduate to the Cubs and then the Scouts after that, innit?
Yeah, I dropped out of Scouts. Didn't like it.
See, we are so similar, Phil. I didn't do the Scouts either. I only got as far as Cubs and I gave up on it. And if none of you out there understand the context of the terminology beaver within the kind of, societal function that it performs here within the Great Britons, we apologize. We will give you no additional context.
It is pretty, worldwide organisation.
I think it is pretty universal, isn't it? Anyway. Let's get into it because I've already skimmed ahead, and clearly we're not going to give this review the gravitas that it deserves. Hi, guys. I've been listening to you from way back in episode 3. Obviously, thank you very much for doing that. Our audio quality was utterly awful back then, and it was a bit of a messy business. Not that we've really massively improved overall in terms of production, but at least we sound a little better, right, Phil?
One would hope.
Indeed. I suffer from extreme anxiety, so much so that I would have panic attacks in my car before starting work. Listening to your podcast distracts me from that. Don't know what it is. Maybe it's the soothing voices. So every week for the last 3 years, you guys have made my life 100 times easier to manage. Thank you so much. Please keep going, because if you do, I won't be able. If you don't, I won't be able to go to work. All the best, Capocalypse. Noting there, obviously, as I actually started to get into the bulk of that statement, I didn't do my patented interrupting every single, moment to wax lyrical, add a kind of comedy spin upon these things, because quite clearly that is quite a lovely, heartwarming story about how we've had actually a positive impact on someone. And obviously, I myself do not deal with extreme anxiety, but I definitely have and do suffer with, mild bouts of anxiety here and there. I'm not sure whether I've said this before in terms of on the podcast or recording it and so on, but a big reason why this podcast exists was definitely to help myself with issues that I've been having throughout the years with depression and anxiety and general kind of weird midlife crisis related fun. 35 is a weird time in someone's life for all sorts of existential nonsense. And the podcast has been hugely helpful to me in terms of giving me some kind of semblance of meaning beyond going to work and existing day by day. So the fact that, it may have, positively impacted your life is an incredibly heartwarming and lovely thing to hear. So sincerely, thank you very much. And apologies for being so flippant about it all in the build up to it. I really should have read this before I kind of introed my way into it. But to expand on all of that is, of course, Philip.
Capocalypse. If it was only cat apocalypse, that would be even more interesting. Who doesn't like one of those? But either way, thank you very much for your kind, soft and soothing words. I'm glad that we, with our soft and soothing words, can make your week much better. I sort of feel like now, and I've said it before, Dan, we're now indebted to the people to the point where we're contractually obliged to keep going for yet another year. We can't stop now, because imagine poor Apocalypse can't go to work if he's not got his episode to listen to. What would he do?
I mean, that is a lot to put on me there, Phil. I mean, not that we are talking about stopping anytime soon, although we do always review every year. We are starting those conversations about next year. The general vibe being is that we want to keep going, but we might need to revise our scheduling. But that's something we can talk about in the outro, I guess. But before we do that, we've got a bunch of other stuff to get to. But yeah, sincerely thank you. And obviously, if you want to be much like I'm gonna not bother with that anymore. Apocalypse. Obviously, please leave us a 5-star review, and we'll get around to calling it out at some point in the not too distant future. But until then, we're gonna get on with the show. Transitional noise. Woo! All right, then, Phil. This is, by all accounts, one of the more entertaining ways that we approach the podcast thingamabob, because we don't really have a specific topic for conversation. So we've effectively picked something that we're going to talk about, that we have an opinion on. And by all accounts, these are usually some of the more entertaining things that we do. I mean, what's your general vibe on this kind of segmentorum, Phil?
I find talking about something that isn't a codex so much more interesting.
It is a very refreshing change, it has to be said. Not that I don't enjoy the codex segments. I think it's an important part of the ongoing, process. And, they're very good on the numbers, Phil. That Orc Codex review has done far better week on week than us talking about the Book of Fire the week before. So there's obviously something in it. And, we're all about them numbers, aren't we, Phil? We're all about them numbers.
Well, that's funny, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about.
Phil, I put it out there. I was putting it down, and you were picking up on my wavelength. I was like, oh, come on, Phil, pick up on this. Yeah, that's right. We're talking numbers, everybody. The art of the number. Now, in the eyes of many, numbers, or by extension, maths, is, the language of gods. Or God specifically, depending on your interpretation of all the various biblical, happenings that you might subscribe to or, believe in. And if you do, fair play to you. Good on you. And if you don't, equally good. Whatever you want, you do you. Anyway, before I get too deep into that potential rabbit hole, numbers and the impact that has in terms of the narrative and the kind of overall impact on game. Or in-game, as it were. So I suppose the best place to start with the numbers conversation is the relative point of comparison and establishing some of the ideas that we're going to almost certainly hark back to in terms of our points of comparison. And for those of you who have listened to the show regularly over the course of the last few months, you know what this means. This means us taking a relative nostalgic view at what used to be the stat line and or its impact. So in the olden days of Warhammer 40,000, pretty much every edition before 8th edition, basically, all units, models had a stat line with a series of numbers that were always between 1 and 10, right? There was never an instance where a thing in Warhammer 40,000 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th edition had a stat that exceeded 10, unless I am entirely wrong, Phil.
I believe predominantly it was 1 to 10, but there were examples where it could go over. So, and the main one being leadership, because that was up to 12 in theory, or could be buffed above 10. And I do think certain, like Chaos Demons in 6th and 7th edition, could be buffed to go over. So you could actually have rare instances where you could have attacks, I think, that could go above 10. But the actual baseline stats, 1 to 10 is for the most part, bar leadership, that sometimes went to 11 or 12.
Yes, indeed. And again, the thing that was really interesting about the engine that kind of powered Warhammer 40,000 in the olden years was that the game of Warhammer 40,000, or Horus Heresy as it is today, is a much more, as we've waxed lyrical about before, kind of mechanical construct in terms of its rule set. The ideas that kind of fuel those types of games is much more linked to the numbers and the relationships that they have to each other. And it's important as well to state that movement was not a fixed stat line number, at least from 3rd edition onwards. The movement was taken away in the creation of 3rd edition from 2nd edition, and then was returned alongside the AP value, essentially reducing saves in 8th edition. And why that's significant, I suppose, is that before certain unit types effectively denoted certain movement values, or certain war gear gave you access to certain movement values. And this is no longer the case, in so much as you now are in a situation where you can express distances that vary per model to model. So, an orc now moves slower than a Space Marine. A Space Marine moves slower than Craftworld Elder or Drakari or Harlequins, for that matter. Any flavor of elf. So that is an interesting additive. I mean, what do you think the movement characteristics or the return of the movement characteristic has done for the state of the game overall, Phil? Because that's probably an interesting numbered statistic that's worthy of some debate.
Now you're asking. I think it's probably a good idea. I like that kind of granularity that every unit could have potentially a different movement value. Taking it away from basically all infantry must be a fixed, 6 inches. Cavalry, was it 8 or 12 or something back in
12, I believe, for cavalry.
6th and 7th edition. It sort of makes sense that an elder live sprightly character or person would run faster than a human, for example. So it totally makes sense to express that by giving each unit their own movement characteristic. Does it complicate the game? Not that much, I don't think. I think having all infantry set to a particular distance and all cavalry set to another particular distance actually kind of makes for a slightly drier representation of how these units are moving around on the tabletop.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. I think where I am in favor of everyone having the fixed distances is how essentially the game designers can build in mechanics based on those distances. So there are always methods by which the game designers can create innate balance. I think one of the issues of the variable movements is it does create more instances where things can be unnecessarily aggressive. Add to that, and this is beyond the kind of nature of the communication, or rather the segment that we're trying to produce here, I suppose. But add to that the mechanics that facilitate double movement and other things that have been kind of added into the game. And I think these move characteristics can and often do create a lot of very interesting instances that you wouldn't come to expect if you had been playing the game 5, 6, 7 years ago, where the idea of turn one charges or that level of kind of oppressive movement was just absolutely,
I guess it just wasn't really heard of in those days. And I think it's that thing of, because you've got so many variation, every single unit could potentially have a different unit stat line. But I think the real issue is every codex has their own stratagem. So you do get these odd edge cases where it's like, if I can give a really high move unit a double move ability, if that was on an infantry and they were all 6 inches, the outcome of that. But if all of a sudden you're doing that on a jet bike that's got like a 14-inch movement, then you go, well, that's just crazy. But those things do exist in the current edition of the game. So you could say that's unintended consequences. You could say that's the intention of the game, that these things, are planned for.
Yeah, I suppose this is the thing, though, isn't it? It's something that kind of creates more kind of dynamic, more kind of heroic instances within the game, and it's something that allows you to express the fact that this is a mobile unit. So why shouldn't it be able to make its way into combat early doors? And I think in essence, I'm in favor of adding the move characteristics back into the game, though. I do wish that more effort would have been taken on the behalf of the designers to try and make it less abusive, as it seems like it could be in some instances. But irrespective of that, I think, ultimately I am in favor of mechanics that allow you to kind of express some individuality and some ideas around the functionality of a unit and why that unit is different from others. Which I suppose brings us on to the next stat line, which in my opinion is actually the stat line.
Could I interrupt before we move on away from
No,
move?
Please.
Can we potentially jump ahead, because this isn't really a stat line, but talk about charging?
Oh, yeah.
Well, because at the moment, 2d6 is pretty random. Whereas in older editions, and I think even in the new kill team, your charge is effectively your move. So you've got a much more consistent ability and range, and it does still represent, fast moving units can charge further than, standard baseline humans or grots or marines and terminator armor, which are a bit more slow and lumbering. So if it's your charge distance is actually tied to your movement, or tied to your movement plus, an extra 1 or 2 inches to represent the fact that you are charging, or even, double your movement. Not that I think that would be a good idea. But I think that kind of ability is better than just like a random dice roll of 2d6, because there's so much swing in that kind of random probability of that roll.
Well, I feel like the 2d6 move is done in a way to neutralize some of the efficiency of the move, though, as well, because I think at the end of the day, even when you're in a situation where you've got a 6-inch charge, nothing is guaranteed, and I think that's important still for the relative balance of the game, right? You don't want everything being a certainty, like the idea that your charge range was going to be 6 inches off the back of a move or whatever, or your move again, like you could start to do some really big exploits with that. But again, it was one of those sort of, and again, this is less so to do with the kind of ideas around the segment, but more to do with a kind of point of comparison between editions. I think the game of old used to have a lot of give and take in it. There were certain negatives associated with certain actions, so your unit wasn't always able to be functional in all phases, whereas obviously now the idea is that essentially you can shoot it wherever you want, you can move wherever you want, you can charge wherever you want. It's a much more flexible game in terms of what you can express on the tabletop in terms of how this unit behaves. And I think that is one of the interesting things, is that there's very little kind of restrictions. So in a way, the random movement is an assist in terms of at least making things slightly more, dare I say, balanced. Although
I would say it goes in the other way, because if you can move 6 inches and then you can charge 2d6, the average is 7. So effectively you can move twice in a turn, plus you get 3 inches to pile in, plus you get 3 inches to consolidate. So like in the current edition, you can move loads in the combat phase via charging. And that's sort of, not to say it's exploited, but it's seen as the top play for the best players. It's all about movement, and a lot of that is all about charging, or sort of exploiting your charge in terms of, in 8th edition, it was all about daisy chaining your stuff around. So you're charging something, but really you actually want something beyond the unit you're actually charging. Whereas if it was, say, if movement and charging was tied together, like it might have been in previous editions, where you can either move 6 inches or you can charge, which is like your move plus a d6. It's like that's going to be a lot less than a move plus 2d6, for example. Yeah. And potentially, I think you do need, when it comes to combat, slowing the game down a little bit, because I don't know if it's a problem, but the game is all about units can sort of get everywhere with relative ease on smaller boards, especially with faster moving units. I don't know, just throwing that idea out there.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. I think it is a mechanical issue within the game in terms of the way that they have facilitated the move, shoot, move, attack system. Again, in older editions, it was asserted that, your charge was double your movement, but you had to do it in place of your movement. And by having completed a charge, you no longer could shoot, because you'd obviously moved into an attack range. So you did so, you did so Sorry, say that again, Phil.
It was just a trade-off, basically, charging instead of shooting. Yeah, I do like the sort of random element to it, and I think a certain amount of randomness in the game is needed to be fun. And those key moments of people failing a charge can be frustrating for players, but it can also be really fun for the person being charged.
Well, indeed. I think, but to your point, though, I think that here's an interesting sort of mechanical shift. I don't know how they necessarily address it without a complete fundamental change of the game, and I think ultimately the team at Games Workshop are pretty well wedded to this move, shoot, charge mechanic, because it's been at the bedrock of their gaming design principles since 3rd edition, and obviously made its way into fantasy, and then off the back of fantasy became one of the core aspects of Age of Sigmar. So this move, shoot, assault mechanic is so rarely not included in gameplay. I think the only time, and again, I haven't obviously seen the new Kill Team rules, but the old Kill Team rules were like the only time where in recent memory where that kind of got taken out, I think, unless Lord of the Rings doesn't have it either, but I haven't played Lord of the Rings.
So the old Kill Team, I believe, still had it in because
But it all happened in the movement phase.
Yes, so you could move or charge in your movement phase, and then you did shooting, then you did combat. In the new one, where you do alternating activations, so it's like you pick a model, I pick a model. I believe you can elect to move or to charge. They're all different types of actions, so you can also shoot as well. I don't think you can shoot and then charge, for example, because I don't know. I think that's just part of the rule, not due to the activation points. But from what I gather, your charge is tied to your movement characteristic, but you might get a certain buff of, a circle or a diamond or whatever, an inch extra. Potentially, I've been watching a couple of sort of playthroughs and rules from other content creators talking about it who've got preview copies. But yeah, I'd be quite interested to see what they've done, because it actually seems like quite a reasonably solid rule set from what I've seen so far.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, we will anticipate what is going to happen on the Kill Team front in due course. But yeah, the next part of this, or like the main stat that probably kind of inspired this conversation, and we received a question essentially about this, which effectively has fueled this conversation, which is the weapon skill and subsequently ballistic skill. And one of the kind of issues that we feel like is occurring because of the fact that everything in the game, or rather not everything in the game, but so much stuff in the game that is of a elite status now is hitting on 2+, and what that is doing to the overall kind of way the game is played, but also just how limiting that is mechanically in terms of expressing certain ideas or communicating the points of difference between characters. Because again, I'll say it again for the sake of tedium, I personally believe that a variable weapon skill, or not variable weapon skill, but a weapon skill that is essentially comparable between characters is important for establishing points of difference. I think having a numbered kind of system between 1 and 10 that denotes someone's kind of martial prowess in combat is a much more meaningful way to kind of express how combat occurs, because obviously you can be one of the greatest combatants, one of the greatest swordsmen in this, albeit fictional universe, but there has to be some account for the skill of your opponent. And I think it becomes a bit absurd when an elite unit of say Blade Guard, admittedly they need a buff to achieve weapon skill 2+, they need to be within range of their Blade Guard Ancient, but a unit of Blade Guard inspired by a Blade Guard Ancient are as capable at hitting stuff in combat as Roberto Guilliman starts to feel a little bit absurd. And I think it's one of the mechanics that has really kind of created a lot of weird repetitiveness within 40k and has sort of robbed it of some of its personality. I think making weapon skill just a standard to hit roll was a mistake, and I think having so much stuff in the game hitting on twos is just a bit boring. But I don't know. What do you think, Phil? What's your vibe on 2+ to hit, or any number to hit?
Yeah, I mean, I think the original question we got from someone, I can't remember who it was now, was like, there's so much 2+ to hit that re-rolls. Is this ruining the game? And it's an interesting way to sort of identify that someone is the very best at something by basically being, how do you get better than a 2+? It's a 2+ with a reroll. Is that fun to play against? Is it a fun mechanic? Is it a bit of a crutch to use a reroll in that instance? Sort of looking back at older editions, like the way weapon skill and ballistic skill worked was, I don't know, there was lots of interesting ways of going about it. So I think first and second edition, and even maybe some other editions of the game, your ballistic skill, it wasn't a number. It was like it is now. So, you had 1 up, 2 up, 3 up. But weirdly, it went from, you could have a minus number, although actually it was a weapon skill. So if your weapon skill was like 8, you would be hitting on -4, for example. But the difference in those systems is there were so many negative to hit modifiers. So you shooting over half range, -1 to hit. Is the person behind cover, another -1, and it all stacked. So you could have an interesting way of differentiating the, how good someone is by having, effectively, if your weapon and ballistic skill is a range of 1 to 10, that's obviously so much more granular than 1 to 6. Especially when 1 isn't really a thing. So really it's a 2 to 6 option. So 1 to 5. So that was an interesting mechanic. And then there's others. So when it comes to weapon skill, in the days of old, you had the crazy weapon skill tables, and obviously you had strength and toughness tables as well, which I think you memorized down pretty well, but I always really struggled with them. But it was like, if you both had a similar weapon skill, you'd be hitting on 4s. If you were, I think, 1 point higher, you probably were still hitting on 4s. But then if you were 2 points higher or lower, maybe, or they were 2 points higher, then you'd be hitting on 5s, for example. And depending on which edition or which game system you're in, they sometimes capped out. So I know Mordheim, for example, the best you can hit in combat is on a 3. So 3+ is, you could have weapon skill 10 against, weapon skill 1, and you're still hitting on 3s, which is a bit odd, but in a way it stops making combat too powerful. And then you go in the other direction, where if someone had a really high weapon skill, I think you could get to a way where you couldn't even hit them, for example. Or it would just cap out at 6, maybe. So you could always hit them on a 6. I know there are certain tables where you get some slightly different options. So this is strength and toughness. So there's a Warhammer game called Legends of the Old West, which is part of Warhammer Historicals. And that has, I think, when it comes to strength and toughness, for example, it's skipping ahead in the stat lines, but it's sort of all still relevant because it's comparison tables. If you are strength 1 and you're trying to hit something toughness 10, in a lot of editions of the game, you just couldn't do it. For example, it would cap out and you couldn't win them at all. And this, it had a number which was like 6 followed by 5. So if you rolled a 6 on your first wound roll, you could roll again, and you then needed to get the second number. So you needed a 6 followed by 5, for example, or 6 followed by 4. Which is an interesting mechanic to represent how difficult it is for that thing to happen, but it's still achievable, which feels like a slightly better mechanic than what we have now, where everything just gets wounded on a 6. And then you can... Oh, go on.
No. I was going to say, I mean, it just sounds like a system desperately in need of a D10, but
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, going back into that kind of wargaming book so I'm going to go on a big long ramble now. Going back into that game system where Rick Priestley was talking about how the D6 system got developed for Warhammer Fantasy. It was him and someone else had a game called Reaper before that, which was a D100 system, and they were tasked by, so it was a guy called Brian. It might not be someone at Warhammer, one of the product managers was like, we want to use a D6 system. So how can you have I think it was basically effectively one roll. You're rolling a D100, and that represents everything from you've missed to you've hit, like a critical hit where you cut off the head, to you've just sliced a small bit of cuff off their shirt. From that whole range of 1 to 100, like you could have so many different things, and that was represented by 2 D10s. So you roll one dice for 10s, another for 1s, and they had to represent that down into some dice rolls for D6s. And obviously one dice roll isn't enough. I think in those days they had like a to hit roll, and then they had like an effect roll, so they effectively had a stack of 2 dice rolls together. And what they came up with is they decided they needed 3 dice rolls in a row. So you had a to hit roll, a to wound roll, and then a saving throw roll. Admittedly, that roll's done by your opponent, but those 3 dice rolls, I think it was something like 100 and maybe it was even more, like 120 odd different possibilities of what all those 3 dice rolls could be. So by stacking 3 dice rolls in a row, you have a greater granularity than a D100, which is sort of how they've created their system of doing stuff. And also gives them some really, you can sort of work out the probabilities of things. So in the book, he goes in and explains, like, you work out, it's called like a P number, which is like the probability of something happening. So he basically talks about 1 guardsman shooting at 1 space marine, and then he goes, well, you can then average that out based on the probability numbers, and it's like you then take a squad of 10 guardsmen shooting for an entire game of like 5 turns, shooting at a squad of space marines, and you just assume that no one else is shooting at them, so the guardsmen at full strength the entire time. And he goes through the maths of it all and breaks it down, and basically says that on average a space marine, well, not more than 1 space marine, so basically I think it's like 3.23 space marines will die. And this was obviously when space marines are at 1 wound. So statistically, you can sort of work out the average of how efficient a unit is based on those dice rolls. Going back to the bit about where you would roll 1 dice and then another in terms of the strength and toughness, I can't remember which edition of the game it is, maybe you'll remember, but sometimes when your ballistic skill was so good, so say you had a ballistic skill of 8, you would basically be hitting on 2+, but then when you rolled a 1, you got to re-roll it. So you basically would hit on 2s, but you miss, you roll again, and then you need another number, so maybe you need a 4 to hit. So it was like a kind of scaled re-roll that wasn't just, I need a 2+ to hit, and I can re-roll it, and I still need 2+.
Yeah, so that definitely was introduced from 5th edition, or rather it was in 5th edition. Whether it was introduced earlier than that, I couldn't say with absolute certainty, but I know for certain it's in 5th edition, and I feel like I could assert that it probably existed in 4th edition as well. But yeah, the concept of that was essentially that, if you were ballistic skill 5, you hit on a 2. If you were ballistic skill 6, you hit on a 2, and you re-rolled on a 6. The general principle being that you took your ballistic skill, subtracted 5 from it, and then what remained was then your new ballistic skill that you then had the re-roll on. So effectively, you were ballistic skill 5 for your first shot, and then you became ballistic skill 1 for your next shot because of the, spillover effect of the ballistic skill that you had access to. So if you were ballistic skill 10, you would hit on 2s, re-rolling on 2s. Because obviously those would be 2 individual 5s. And minus modifiers to hits and things like that were really, really non-existent as far as I can remember in the older editions. And I think that was kind of done in a way to sort of, compensate for other kind of system mechanics. But again, we're not necessarily wanting to get too in deep on systems. It's more just about the numbers and what these numbers facilitate. And I think that's the thing. Again, I feel like having a ballistic skill value that is numbered 1 to 10 denotes a level of quality that feels appropriate to me. I think, at the end of the day, when you say that this unit is ballistic skill 5, you go, oh, crikey, they can hit on 2s. That's really strong. Ah, yes, but this unit is ballistic skill 8. You're like, oh, wow, they can hit on 2s, re-rolling on 4s. Like, okay, well, that's a totally different ball game. That's a really strong unit. So again, it's about expressing those ideas. And again, where I felt like this was always most important was with units of great kind of, or rather kind of, creatures or, heroic figures within the fiction that are of relative parity in terms of where they reside within the fluff. But there are subtle, nuanced differences between them. And I felt like this was most interestingly expressed through things like the Primarchs, because obviously the Primarchs are predominantly the same sort of thing, right? They're all incredibly capable at shooting, fighting. They're all pretty tough, so on and so forth. You can still express the strength and the toughness element, but when it comes down to ballistic skill and weapon skill, with maybe the exception of Agron, who I could imagine they could arguably give a ballistic skill of 3+, although I'd think it would be a ridiculous thing to do. The idea that any of these Primarchs, as they're represented in 40k, will not be ballistic skill, weapon skill 2+ is just absurd. But then therein lies the question: how do we start to discern who is the more capable in the certain areas? I know that Mortarion, even if he wasn't a demon, is tougher than Guilliman, but I don't know who's better in fighting other than the volume of attacks maybe, and then a bunch of subsequent rules. And I think that was always one of the interesting things, because without knowing the Horus Heresy stat lines almost at all, you could very easily communicate to me that Guilliman is a incredible fighter, but he isn't as good in a fight as Lionel Johnson, by a simple difference of a 7 on Guilliman and an 8 on Lionel Johnson under weapon skills. So now all of a sudden, Lionel Johnson is hitting Guilliman in combat on 3s, whereas Guilliman hits him on 4s. Now it's a small difference, but it's massive. And I think that beautifully expressed the points of difference between these types of characters. And it's something that I feel quite regretful that we don't have at the moment, because again, as I keep saying, the only way that we can start to express the idea that Guilliman is more efficient in certain level styles of combat than Lionel Johnson, should a Lionel Johnson come somewhere down the line, we can only express that through rules. We can only express that through written rules,
like the special abilities and stuff.
Yeah, we can't just do it through the system. And I thought that was always one of the really subtly, awesome things about the old system. It felt to me that stat lines always felt more significant before, because you would read the stat line and it meant something to you. When you saw a unit that was weapon skill 10, you were like, good Lord, this thing is, weapon skill 10. That's really impressive. Whereas if you just said, oh, it's weapon skill 2+, you go, yeah, cool, everything is.
Yeah,
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Sorry, Phil.
I don't mind it from the point of view for a ballistic skill, because that just makes sense. Like, oh, something can hit on 2s, great. It speeds up the game, that you don't have to do any kind of mental arithmetic to go, oh, well, my ballistic skill is 4. What does that represent? Although, interestingly, I was reading the Rogue Trader book a while ago, and they sort of explained how it works. So it's like a weapon skill, or ballistic skill of 4 is representative of a 4 in 6 chance to hit. for example. So ballistic skill of 1 is a 1 in 6. So obviously you need a 6. So you're effectively taking away that number from your 6, aren't you? To work it out.
Nicely done.
So in a way, I don't mind that step coming out. They obviously did it for things like your agility stats in Blood Bowl recently. So they got rid of your agility being 4 and just changed it to like a 3 up, because that's normally what it represents. Just because it just makes so much more sense to just go, that's my dice roll, done. And when it comes to weapon skill, though, I think what they should have done is done the similar thing to what they do with strength and toughness now. So you don't need a complicated chart. You just compare your weapon skills, you and your opponents. Is it the same? You hit on 4s. Is it 1 higher? If yours is 1 higher, you hit on 3s. If it's double, then you hit on 2s. If it's 1 lower than your opponents, you're hitting on 5s, and if it's double theirs or half of theirs, then you're hitting on 6s. That feels like a really nice way where you can get some granularity in comparison of how good someone is at combat, without having to go down into this kind of complicated table grid that you used to in previous editions.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I just think, again, though, it's one of those situations where, again, I loved the way the system used to work in terms of expressing the way that these units played or how these units behave. I loved the system as much as people had their issues with it. I thought it was really sophisticated and really interesting with the way that it could get across the fact that this is better than this because this. And I do feel like it's a thing that we lose out on as a result. Although I will acknowledge that I'm happy enough on the ballistic skill side of things. Again, it's a small concession, but I just think it's more impactful though to the overall impact of the stat line, right? Because I'll be honest with you, another reason why I was really interested in talking through this is because I don't necessarily feel like the stat lines of characters ever meaningfully impact my opinion of them. It feels more and more now that you're interested in the weapons that they bring, the number of models that you can field in that unit, and then all of the supporting words that make up the unit. Does it have the core keyword? Can it have this faction? Is it this does it unlock all of these extra rules that I get as a result of this book? These seemingly now are the most important things, because the game is lacking so many kind of interesting mechanical elements that effectively stat lines don't really feel that important, whereas volume of miniatures or the amount of models feels more important. Like, the game is such that it just feels to me that the more models you can get for the least amount of points seems to be the bleeding edge of it. But maybe I'm a bit incorrect in that assertion, but I do feel like that is being supported by the evolving kind of meta and the style of gameplay that is prevailing on the top tables. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. What do you think?
I think people are always going to look for those kinds of efficiencies of min-maxing, like optimizing units which are really cheap, and looking, it's sort of like a mini exploit within the game, going, oh, this is a bit cheaper than it really deserves to be. But in doing so, you're basing that quite often based on their stat line. I think maybe we just take the stat line for granted nowadays because it's been around for such a long time. Maybe some of them are, a lot of them are kind of average. So you do look at the weapons though. Like, if something has ×2 strength, you're like, oh, that's pretty good. How much is its AP? How much is its damage? Like, those are all things we all look at. Maybe the actual person's individual characteristics, it depends on what it is, really. Like, quite often toughness is quite a key characteristic, I think, and the save are probably the two main things that or maybe number of wounds, right? Depending on the unit though, maybe you go, I want this thing to, if it's a cavalry unit, you want it to have high movement because you want it to get around the board. If you're looking for a durable unit, you want something with a really good save, really high toughness, and maybe lots of wounds. So you don't look at a unit and go, I want it to be best at everything. And it should never really be the case. It should have peaks and troughs in its stat line to make it good at certain things and bad at others, so you can, give it a job to do on the tabletop. Going back to what you said about ballistic skill, though, it made me think what they should do is incorporate that reroll that we were talking about. So, if you've got a weapon skill of a ballistic skill of 10, and that basically equals a 2+ with a 2+ reroll, which is interesting because basically that's now a captain, right, or a chapter master. Hits on 2s.
Well, not anymore because they removed that ability, but yeah.
Well, he can reroll 1s on himself via an ability.
If he gives himself a rule, yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting because before he would be probably hitting on 3s with no reroll. Or maybe he'd be hitting on 2s at best, but definitely not with reroll. So it's interesting that now the comparison of like a chapter master hitting on 2s with a reroll is the equivalent of ballistic skill 10 in Days of Old, which was crazy good. Like even Chaos Demons, like greater demons, didn't always have ballistic skill that high.
I don't even think the Vindicare Assassin had a.
I think that there was 8, so it was good.
Yeah, I think it was high, but not 10.
But what you could do is, as I was saying from the Warhammer Legends Wild West game, is you incorporate that reroll into the stat line. So if it's hitting on 2s, rerolling 2s, your ballistic skill is 2-2. So you don't need to do any mental arithmetics to work out what the reroll is, but it's just built there into the stat line, and therefore you also reduce abilities that give things rerolls as well, because it's actually, if they're meant to have a reroll because they've got a good ballistic skill, it's like it's on their stats potentially.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think if they did start adding in those elements, I think it could be super interesting. But again, I think the problem is mechanically with the game that they've established, layering in like a 2-2 profile. Again, it just sort of adds an element of added, not complexity, but it's just an added kind of mechanic.
Well, it's a visually cluttering it from a very simple thing, because basically everything now is either, you got weapon skill, ballistic skill, save. They're all a dice roll. Everything else is a stat. So to give a ballistic skill, and this would only be a couple of characters really with an inbuilt reroll. That would be, 2-4, for example. That would only be on a couple of characters. But visually, looking at that stat line, it kind of just looks a bit messy. So I could see why they wouldn't necessarily want to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I understand. Again, you're exactly right. I think it gets a bit kind of ugly when you start having to add in all those extra kind of layers to it. And obviously, again, I acknowledge the potentially hypocritical view that might make me seem like I have, when obviously I was suggesting that having a higher weapon skill or ballistic skill and all the innate abilities that come along with that are beneficial to the game. I'm just saying that it creates an interesting dynamic is all. And I think the thing is that the overabundance of 2+ to hit is, I think, a problem with the game overall. I think, irrespective of historical precedent, I think the volume of models in Warhammer 40,000 that hit on 2s is a little bit on the absurd side of things. And I think it's only become even more extreme with the introduction of like units and things that seemingly have, quite a good level of access to that level of ballistic skill or even weapon skill. I remember when we first laid eyes on the incubi for the Drakari, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, these guys are weapon skill 2+, and it's like, well, hang on a second here, like that's bonkers. But this is happening more and more as they try and kind of address some of the mechanical problems they've created in the game, and how they need to essentially kind of create lethality, because effectively now the only way that you can really give assured levels of lethality in 40k is by giving those kind of absurd stat lines, whereas before there was a series of like gameplay mechanics that kind of compensated for these elements. and added a kind of, struggle to the exchange, notwithstanding obviously all the things that people were doing to exploit the systems back then. But I think that's the thing. I think the overabundance of like 2+ to hit is a problem for the game, because I think it just sort of, in the way that range is an issue, I feel like the to hit rolls are just too good at the moment, and it sort of just becomes a bit absurd when everything is hitting on 2s, or even 3s. Like 3s are being thrown around like sweets, right? Like everyone's, everything hits on 3s now. Like hardly anything hits on 4s. I mean, I know stuff does, but like it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It sort of makes, obviously, the game much more lethal. And does it need to be toned down, I guess, is the question. If something can hit on 2s, it's, especially with a reroll, it's just like almost statistically, like not 100%, but like, good 90% chance or more that it's going to hit and do its job. And it's like, it is meant to be a dice game. And when you have things hitting on 2+s or saves being made on a 2+, for example, you really take the kind of the dice element out, because it's almost like a guaranteed factor, especially with rerolls. Whereas, yeah, like I said, you could tone things down. Like, I was talking about Mordheim. The best you could hit in combat is a 3. You couldn't get 2s at all. It was just like impossible.
Well, that was the case in Warhammer 40,000 up until 8th edition. That's the thing. Like, again, people forget this, but in Warhammer 40,000 7th edition, the best you could hit on was a 3, unless you were Khan the Betrayer. And that's the only person I could think of that could hit on 2s.
Yeah.
Because he specifically had a special rule stating he always hits on 2s, and he cannot re-roll his attacks for any reason. So if he rolls a 1, he then does a wound to an ally, assuming that he's in a squad with an ally. But obviously everyone knew better than to put Khan the Betrayer in a squad, so he tended to
be on his own,
run by himself. But
yeah, that's the thing. So potentially making stuff too good is detrimental to the game to some extent, especially if there's a lot of it floating around. So get him and hitting on 2s. Yeah, that he makes sense.
Yeah, of course.
A standard, even an elite unit, should that really be hitting on 2s? You could argue yes, because they're better than the regular guys. But and this is the problem with the granularity, it's like you can't get a 2.5 ballistic skill or weapon skill. So how do you represent something being better than a Space Marine but not as good as a Primarch? It's like you physically can't, because that's the D6 system. I mean, yeah, you could say hit on 3s, but they get to re-roll, for example. That's another, way of doing it. But then I also think the game has too many re-rolls built into the general DNA of 8th and 9th edition. It seems to have been their go-to. Maybe it's being toned down more in 9th as the codexes are coming out, but in 8th edition it just seemed like it was everywhere, and it was like the one mechanic that they were throwing in, like, candy.
Candy, Phil.
Have some candy for our American
candy.
listeners.
We don't say candy here. Come on now.
Have some sweets.
Dear, oh dear.
I'm chucking them at you.
Have some sweeties. Oh, some lovely sweeties. Yeah, no, I agree with you, mate. And I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? It's like, it's kind of this weird scenario where it's just an abundance of riches in terms of what they've given out to players, and there just seems to be this unwillingness to sort of actually establish consistent or meaningful kind of like stat comparisons, as it were. And I think that's a gameplay design problem, because again, it comes back to there is no established like benchmark, like no one's looking at, or if they are, very few people, I feel like from a game design perspective, are looking at like a stat line of even like a Space Marine and going, right, well, this is normal for our game, is, this is an elite unit. So it's that thing. It's like, it feels to me that like 4+ to hit should be the norm, and then you should work back and forth from that. Space Marines by default are elite, so therefore they go to 3, but only the most like seasoned veterans should go to 2. And I'm not talking about Blade Guard veterans, which admittedly, as I've stated before, are only boosted to 2+ to hit by, the addition of a banner bearer. But the point is that there are other units that are hitting on 2s within the Space Marine ranks. But I feel like it should really just be limited to like captains, lieutenants. Lieutenants should be like, in fact, the lieutenant should be free and free. Like, I genuinely think like it should just be, I am a captain, therefore I have 2+ to hit. Chaplains, librarians, all these guys should be frees to hit. The idea that they are, I mean, to be fair, I think chaplains are ballistic skill 3+, weapon skill 2+, or librarians are, or whatever. But I just think that's the thing where it's like, to use Marines as like the benchmark, it's only the most elite stuff. And then from there on inwards, you should apply that same logic. It's like,
what would you
the idea that
what would you give Custodes then to hit? Because they're better than Marines.
I'd give them 2s.
Oh, so a standard Custode, you'd give them 2.
Yeah, I think so. By the same, because a Custodes is better. But then again, I suppose this is exposing the relative limitations of the system, right? It's like all of a sudden it becomes one of those things where there's no other way of expressing the prowess of a Custodes, right? Because like maybe a Custodes should only hit on 3s with shooting, but like, to use old stat lines, maybe a Custodes is weapon skill 7, ballistic skill 4. Like it's something like that where they really shine is in combat. Maybe they're initiative 6, weapon skill 6, to show that they are that superior in combat, and they're still toughness 5 and they're still strength 5. But, to hit with shooting is still, it's still hitting on 3s because, maybe it really should just be super elite. But again, it's one of those things where you need to go back to the drawing board and fundamentally redesign things and actually kind of establish those ideas. But I genuinely don't understand how we ended up in a situation where anything in the Orc Codex is hitting on 4s. It used to be cute when the Gretchens did it because you were like, Gretchens, they're just firing little pew-pew guns, or maybe they're a killer can or whatever. But now that the freebooters have got ballistic skill 4+, it's like, oh, come on, guys. Like you've established this orc mechanic for like ages, and it really kind of sings to how they play. And yet even now you're going, but it's time to change it up. Let's give Flash Gits a 4.
Yeah, I don't mind the Flash Gits doing it because they're meant to be the best shooty ones. So if you're going to give it to anyone, it should be to them. If there were other units that also had it, then I'd be probably thinking that's not correct. I see what you mean though. If you're meant to be like all orcs are rubbish at shooting, even the best orcs are rubbish at shooting, then you could just say we're capping them all at 5s no matter what. Maybe a character would be slightly better, but for them to be like all of them are rubbish bar the Flash Gits, I'm kind of okay with, actually. I think that's all right.
I suppose I am too, but like it's just a point though, right? It's like, again, it sort of feels to me like, I mean, the ones that are most egregious is it's stuff like Skitarii being weapon ballistic skill 3+. I get it, right? They're robot people, therefore they're better, but like, again, it's sort of just one of those things. Where
But even Sisters of Battle, they're 3+ as well, aren't they?
Yes, but I'm okay with Sisters of Battle on the same basis that they are an elite force, and there are things that are negative for them, i.e., they have lower strength and toughness. They're strength 3, toughness 3, which again is fine, right? Like that's fine because you've at least created a dynamic that they are, as capable from a kind of combat perspective. They've had the same kind of like training, and they've got all their kind of holy orders that have like, brainwashed them in all the various ways they have. So they've got certain attributes that would make them comparable to a Space Marine in terms of combat potential. They're just not as strong, and they're not as tough. That's fine. That's absolutely fine.
I guess when it comes to Skitarii, they've gone, okay, you've got standard guardsman hits on 4s. These are augmented humans, so therefore are they meant to be better? Therefore 3s? And I guess you also get into the game mechanics of how do we differentiate them from guardsmen? If they hit them 4s and they're basically a shooty army, they're kind of just guardsmen in red. and as an army, they need to be something different. Now, personally,
Well, they do have other ways of conveying that, right? Like they could have been tougher. Like I don't understand why Skitarii aren't toughness 4, for example,
because of their metal legs.
Yeah, well, because just their metal everything, right? I mean, not all of them are just metal legs. They've got a lot of like gubbins going on with them. Or why they don't have? Oh, they do have. They have a 6-up invuln built in, right? Like that's an immediate kind of because they're all bionics or whatever. Like there are ways you can express the differences. It doesn't have to just be, oh, you know. And this is the other. I don't understand the assertion that 4+ is observably bad. I mean, it's 50-50 odds. It feels like it should be the prevailing like stat.
Oh
it
yeah,
like,
and I do think for Skitarii it feels like they should really be hitting on 4s because it's, to me, out of all the Imperium armies, the Guard should be the shooty one, and they've sort of they've stolen our thunder, Dan. They've taken it away from me. So in a way, it's like, and they just make them sort of so good at shooting, and it's like, well, that's what Guard are meant to be good at. So it's like, what are we good at now? Okay. So yeah, maybe to sort of reinforce that aspect of, you know, hitting on 3s is very much elite, that most armies should always hit on 4s, sort of no matter what, unless they are, you know, way better. And you need that kind of comparable scale of humans hitting on 4s, superhumans hitting on 3s. Skitarii aren't superhumans. It's like they're humans with robotic bits. They're better. You could definitely say they're better. They're like 3.5, hitting on 3.5, but you can't get 3.5, so they're still hitting on 4s.
I mean, again, though, I feel like when it comes to Skitarii, I feels like Skitarii should be in a situation where there should be like upgrades or ways that you can increase their ballistic skill. Like I would be absolutely fine with the idea of increasing Skitarii ballistic skill because some tech priest Dominus has basically taken control of the entire, like, what do they call them now? Mandibles or whatever, the canticles or whatever, the army, you know, like maybe.
Well, they can connect to them via the noosphere. And I think in one of the Admech stories, that is exactly what happens. Like the guy is on the ship above, but he's literally like remote controlling them all to make them perform the most optimum efficiency possible.
Yeah, and like putting them into patterns and other things. But then I think, you know, there's ideas that you could express through that. It's like literally a case of you saying, well, you can make your Skitarii, you know, ballistic skill free. But in doing so, you reduce their combat prowess to this, and then also you reduce their movement to this, and you do this to this. Like, you know, there are ways that you could have added a certain protocols to it, which is sort of similar to what they've actually put in, but actually have it fixed for the game, as it were. You know, just be like, oh, you know, you got this, but in return you lose this, which would be fine to me. Like, but yeah, I don't understand why. And to expand on this point, I don't ever understand how Guardians get ballistic skill 3+. Guardians with ballistic skill 3+, which is an Craftworld Aeldari unit, for those who don't know, is an absurdity to me. Like, I genuinely think the Guardians should be ballistic skill 4+. I only think Aspect Warriors should be ballistic skill 3+, and I only think Phoenix Lords should be ballistic skill 2+, or weapon skill 2+, or whatever it is. You know, and then obviously the Avatar as well. But like Eldred Ulfran has no business being ballistic skill weapon skill 2+. None of the Farseers do. They should all be ballistic skill weapons. In all honesty, I think Farseers should be ballistic skill weapon skill 4+ as well, because they're just wizards. You know, it's like, I get it, they're warrior wizards, but it's just wizards. They're a bunch of dudes who spend their time sitting around trying to work out what's going to happen in the future. I don't think they spend that much time training extensively at target practice. You know, it's like it's the psychicness that's their bag. Make them potent psychers. Don't give them ballistic skill 2+. It makes no sense whatsoever. And that's the thing. It's just those are my sort of vibes on it. But again, unfortunately, Games Workshop has ended up in this situation where they consistently just gifted free up ballistic skill. Same thing with the Drukhari. Drukhari across the board should have been ballistic skill, weapon skill 4+, with the exception of witches, which could have been weapon skill 3+. but like everything else should have been ballistic skill 4+. There's no reason why a bunch of loopy pirates that spend all their time cutting each other up in the webway should be marksmen of the equivalent quality of a Space Marine. I get it, they're old, but no, it's just ridiculous. It's like it shouldn't be the case. Like I just think Games Workshop hand out ballistic skill 3+ like it's nothing,
like it's candy,
and like it's sweets. Phil, sweets. But I think it has. I do think it's had an overall negative impact on the game. I remember when I first got, going back to Elder examples, I apologize, but I remember when I first got the 6th edition Elder Codex, and they had increased all of the Guardian weapon skills, or rather ballistic skills, to 3+. And I remember saying something to the effect of, "You're mad. This is a mistake. This breaks this army." But the problem is they've been doing it to everything ever since. They're just handing them out, everywhere.
Yeah, is it like a kind of power creep issue? Is it, as I was saying before, they do want to differentiate it? If you make everything 4+, does it, should armies be almost like identical, but with different paint schemes and a couple of rule tweaks here and there? Like, if you think about really simple games, not saying Horus Heresy is, but there's an easy comparison there where my Marines and your Marines, they're effectively the same, but they've got one or two different rules that are the same. And kind of really, I guess, bad games, whether it's computer games or not, it's like that, something like Command and Conquer, or I don't know if that even was the case, but my troops and your troops, they're exactly the same. And most of my vehicles and your vehicles are exactly the same, but they've got different colors on them. Like, that is, if you make everything similar stat lines, that's sort of what you're doing. Whereas if they're making a deliberate difference to be like, actually Elder play in a totally different way from Space Marines or Guardsmen, they're not just comparable to Guard, but they're quicker, for example. It's like maybe they felt like they needed to change the stat lines around a bit to give each army a bit more flavor and uniqueness to them. Ultimately, you could say it's at the detriment of sort of balance, because actually, maybe more things do need to be a bit worse at stuff rather than just making stuff better.
Yeah. So sorry, Phil. Are you suggesting that they haven't done this, or you're suggesting that that's what they have done? Because I'm confused. Because at the moment, it feels like everything's the same from that stat line perspective.
Well, what I was saying is they've taken stuff from like a weapon skill 4+, toughness 3, or the standard 3-3-3 sort of stat line of old, where ballistic skill and weapon skill 3 meant you hitting on 4s. It feels like they've moved away from that because they didn't want to standardize every single army as having that as like their troops, for example. So they wanted to make Elder Guardians, different from Imperial Guardsmen. So they've gone, well, they probably had better movement already. So it's like, but let's make their ballistic skill better, or their weapon skill and ballistic skill better. I guess what you're saying is they've sort of done that to everything, to the point where everything now hits on 3s as opposed to 4s.
Yes, yeah. And that's my thing. It's like, I don't think. Again, it depends, right? Because I suppose innately, when you reduce the stat line to hit, you reduce the lethality, and if you reduce the lethality, you elongate the game. And that is obviously one of the things you need to consider, right? Is that games of 40k now are played with 2,000 point armies, which are far more numerous in miniatures than the game has ever been, right? Like, it's absurd the amount of miniatures you're putting down on the tabletop. And again, I challenge anyone out there to go out and write a 1,000 point, 2,000 point 5th edition army list and look at the point of comparison of what the last 10 years has done in terms of model count. I mean, again, me and Joe have actually started playing, and Phil hopefully will do soon, start playing some games of 5th again. But yeah, I mean, I'm writing army lists with 18 models in them. And it's still quite an interesting kind of game. Admittedly, that was a 1,000 point army, but by process of doubling that for me to get to a 2,000 point army, I'll be at like 36 models, which I can tell you is a great deal less than what I get in a current day 40k force, even of comparable.
Yeah, and I think that in itself is something that we talked about before, where like Admech and Drakari just seem to get so much for their points. It's kind of crazy, and I think that's probably one of the sort of power creeps behind them. Like, no matter how much you change their abilities, stratagems, for example, if their core units are just too cheap for what they do, that's sort of like a fundamental problem with those armies. And because to me, it's like when I look at Drakari and Admech, it's like you're putting down more models than I'm putting down in a guard army. That's a problem. It feels like the only other person that should be doing that is orcs, really. They're putting down more models than a guardsman on the table. So I think that is something. I mean, you could go down like this kind of giving everything more attacks, giving everything better ballistic skill, but what you end up maybe doing is giving everyone more wounds, and they sort of have been doing that, where almost like 2 wounds is not necessarily the norm, but there's an awful lot more in the range that's going to be having that. Once Chaos Marines, Cantor Blue, once you finally get your 2 wounds buff, obviously orcs don't. They've got better toughness. But if you look at like Kill Team, it's like every single model there has 10 wounds, and you can represent that granularity of their stats and their abilities. Everyone, potentially gets like 5 attacks or something, and it's almost like that's not to say that that's what 40k is doing, but it is going very subtly in that direction of giving everyone loads of attacks, making everything more lethal. But you could argue it's a good thing, right? But because with wounds, you can create more granularity to represent, how tough something is. So if you up the base wound number from 1 to 2, for example, not they would, because then guardsmen would be the same as space marines. But imagine if every guardsman had 2 wounds and a space marine had 4 wounds. It's like suddenly weapons can represent damage in such sort of granular fashion. You could have needle pistols, for example, only doing 1 damage, and a lasgun does 2 damage, and a bolter does 3 damage, and a heavy bolter does 4 damage, for example. You can then have much greater sort of range of abilities and stats, and represent that in a much finer granular detail than you could otherwise. I mean, I don't think that is going to happen, but they're doing it in a sort of way where a lot of stuff like Space Marines have 2 wounds, and a lot of stuff now is just getting a lot more attacks.
Yeah, agreed. But getting back to the crux of it all, how do we feel about the 2 pluses to hit, or rather the 3 pluses, the prevalence of the way that the system is working in a minute? I think, ultimately, if I'm honest with myself and going through this process, I can't necessarily begrudge them for trying to simplify things. I can't. Is it a point of frustration in terms of the way the weapon skill system is implemented? Yeah, I think I've been fairly, upfront about that. But I can't begrudge them for trying to simplify things. I think where it is becoming a problem is because of the amount of it that's getting thrown around. I think they are being too liberal with the application of the 2+, 3+ to hit. I think it needs to be a much more sacred statistic. I think far less stuff should be hitting in combat on 2s, whereas at the moment, are you an HQ option? Yeah, okay, you're going to hit in combat on 2s. That to me starts to become a bit silly, and I think that's what they need to address. I think they need to make it rarer. I think maybe a ballistic skill, weapon skill of 2+ needs to be on a handful of high-ranking officers or high-ranking miniatures, than super elite miniatures than being as available as is, because I think that would be better for the health of the game. But again, there's a lot more balancing that would need to go into consideration if they made that amend. But what do you reckon, Phil?
It's a tough one, really. I think there's probably too many things on a 2+ and too many things that just get rerolls. Even now, I think rerolls should be used much more sparingly. I mean, they're a fun mechanic, but I sort of think it just ruins the randomness of the game, and it just makes things sort of so consistent to the point where it's just, I don't know, it's not fun in a way. I mean, it's fun if you're doing it. I mean, as a guardsman, it's like I get very few rerolls at all, and all my best stuff that can shoot degrades because they're tanks. So it's like I can hit on 3s, but by the end of the game, I'm hitting on 5s. And to me, that's much more of a pet peeve that I have when things get worse as the game goes on. And that's not really a fun mechanic. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's as problematic as stuff hitting on 2s. As a guards player who wants to run tanks, I find anyway, because I don't have anything that hits on 2s. Obviously, go up against people that hit on 2s, and I'm like, oh, cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to go back to the mean average a little bit more. Stuff should be hitting on 4s, maybe 3s, super rare 2s, sprinkling rerolls here and there where appropriate, but whole squads just getting like mass rerolls every single turn seems, I don't know, not the best way of going about things.
Fair enough. Well, there we are. Our opinions and all of that stuff. We're going to move on now to whatever it is that comes next. Transitional noise. Woo! Wow. All right, guys. In this part of the podcast, we're going to address a topic which we haven't gotten around to talking about to any great extent, despite having potentially teased the fact that we might for a while, and that is the humble vehicle within the confines of Warhammer 40,000's 9th edition. So, Phil, you are a frequent fan of things which go fast or are durable or are, broadly considered to be, vehicles. How do you feel in the general sense? How would you preface this segment in terms of the state of the humble vehicle within the game of Warhammer 40,000's 9th edition?
Most of the time, they're a bit pants.
And is there any specific reason why you might utter that sentiment?
Oh god, there's so many. I think one, they're too fragile. They're quite easily to kill. In theory, 2 las cannon shots. Obviously, you got to roll 6s to wound, but 2 las cannon shots will take out one tough Lehman Russ, which is meant to be one of the tougher vehicles in the game. What else is there? I think the main one.
I mean, that would be a heck of a roll, though, right? Like you are dealing in some very, 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 very unlikely circumstances.
But even 3, would be a bit more of an average to do it, I think. And I mean actually hitting and wounding and stuff like. But then you get things like multi-melters, which are quite prevalent. You also get people like Sisters of Battle, which have miracle dice, so they can kind of load up the damage roll. That's quite niche to specific faction. So, I'm mentioning it here, but it's not really a thing. I think the main thing is they get stuck in combat quite easily. They're not very good at taking objectives. They don't really feel like tanks. Like they should be good shock and awe tactics. They should be good at taking territory. Like that's the whole point they were invented in the first place. It wasn't to have a mobile artillery piece. That is something that came along later. But the initial thing was, taking ground in World War One. So it would be great if they could be represented as such. And I think quite often they get poor ballistic skill, at least from a guardsman's point of view. Very poor ballistic skill that just gets progressively worse as the game goes along, to the point where they are literally rolling around 4 inches as tin cans that aren't really doing anything. And they're full of beans in those tin cans.
Delicious Moorish beans. I think to expand on your point in terms of the areas that I would isolate in terms of the problems with vehicles is thus. And Obviously, we need to address the different forms of vehicles because I think each vehicle has its own unique challenges. But I think it's fair to assert that we would want to begin with the tank, because the tank for the longest time has kind of been the purest expression of the vehicle within the confines of Warhammer 40,000. But obviously there are walkers, there are skimmers, there are planes, there are super heavy denominations of any of those variables. There are all sorts of different flavors of vehicles that exist in the game of Warhammer 40,000, but without being too absurd, the greater majority of them have been rendered relatively worthless due in part to a number of factors, such as the way they interact with terrain. I think that has been a real misstep with regards to the vehicles. I understand that because of the size of vehicles, there's always been a complex relationship between vehicles and terrain, because unlike infantry models, they don't have the size to be able to kind of seamlessly interact with the terrain feature within kind of physical, real space. But additionally, I think that the way that they are expressing that within 9th edition has definitely made things more, negative for the vehicles. The fact that vehicles can never gain the benefits of terrain is a massive downside. And the fact that the game has such a heavy emphasis on huge amounts of terrain that they ultimately can't interact with efficiently gives them a lot less tactical flexibility. And I think one of the things about 9th edition is a heavy emphasis on movement. And when you look at things like tanks, they are very much funneled into lanes, as it were. They effectively have to kind of interact within very strict parameters, and everything around them is not suffering the same stipulations. And, any kind of restrictions, any kind of things which will negatively impact the efficiency of units within the 9th edition game system definitely, is a huge negative that has massively contributed to the downfall of the vehicles. They're just not good enough to overcome those negatives, at least when it comes to the movement side of things, which I think in a way is their biggest negative. But maybe there is more. Well, there definitely is more to expand upon. But yeah, I mean, what do you think of all that, Phil?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's they struggle to get around the board because, as you say, things like ruins, they can't just go through them. Not said that they should be able to, but that definitely always hampers them. And something I've always struggled with, even going back to early editions of the game, 6th and 7th edition, you still sort of feel like you're kind of stuck with them. Slowly moving up the board and not really, they're just shuffling around and not able to get anywhere because they don't have the fly keyword. Not that tanks should have fly keyword, but it was always things with the fly keyword could just hop over stuff. So it just made vehicles with fly keyword superbly good and the most optimized units, most efficient ones in the game. And anything that didn't have that just kind of sucked in comparison. It's good. Well, in a way, it's good that less stuff has it now. So, all the grav tanks from Primaris Marines, they've kind of stripped the fly keyword away from them. A bit sad now I actually have some of them, but that is fine and probably better for the overall kind of health of the game. It feels like they should have, if you're going to buff anything's movement, it probably should be vehicles, just allow them to get around the board a bit better, to go around terrain. Just to get those benefits. I think the interaction with the terrain is probably the worst one with the sort of change to 7th and 8th edition. They don't ever get a cover save. And you could argue, if you're shooting at a tank, what's a hedge going to do really to a tank? It's not really going to make a difference. But if there's a big concrete wall in front of them, that would surely protect it from a las gun, any more so than its normal armor would. So it sort of feels odd that they've just sort of arbitrarily not given vehicles an ability to get a cover save or increase its save in any way. If if they were so tough and durable in the first place, you could argue they don't need it. But that's not actually the case. I think they're too easy to damage, and I think what you're seeing now is the mechanic of -1 damage being applied to pretty much all vehicles or dreadnoughts and walkers, to represent vehicles' durability that they sort of deserve. But that feels like a really like plaster as a rules mechanic. Having to apply that to all vehicles sort of feels like you're fixing something at the very back end of a rules system rather than up front. So it should really be something to do with, the weapon profile when it's working against a vehicle, as opposed to the very tail end of a damage step where you're like, oh, we're just -1 to this damage. I mean, in a way, it does work. It just doesn't feel like it's the most elegant solution. And I'm going to be a really annoying internet commentator and say I don't necessarily have one up front. Maybe I'll think about it and try and come up with something over the course of this conversation.
No, fair enough, mate. Fair enough. I mean, obviously, please, work on that in the background. But no, I think when it comes to the decisions that they've made about their interactivity with terrain, it's been really interesting. And I think the changes to the fly keyword, because I think actually also the thing that we need to establish here is obviously 9th edition's most close point of comparison is 8th edition. And in the game of 8th edition, the vehicle was in a healthy place, not necessarily the tank, but the vehicle as a whole. Certainly those vehicles that had access to the fly keyword, they were strong and they were ever present as a result. I mean, part of the power of the Aeldari armies was the fact that they had such, mobile, firepower heavy vehicles that all had the fly keyword. And as a result, that meant that vehicle was very consistently featured. As too was the Primaris Repulsor, which again had access to the fly keyword and was itself a tank. So these rules and these vehicles really were performing well, and they had this whole kind of durability meets combat efficiency because of their movement, because of their firepower, because of the fact that they could leave combat and still shoot with no penalties. This was a good series of mechanics that, though not necessarily made the vehicle universally good just by virtue of it being a vehicle, it definitely led to some very strong vehicle heavy armies because of the fly mechanic as it was in that edition. Taking that away from vehicles and changing the way the fly mechanic works now has definitely had a very real impact on the overall viability of vehicles based on that kind of mechanic. And I think one of the things that's interesting is I think what we saw in 8th edition is a relative demonstration that it doesn't necessarily take much to make vehicles interesting. You need a few rules, a few things just to give them a little bit of an edge, or not even just an edge, just give them some competitive viability. And I think people will take them. But I think at the moment, I think the changes they gave vehicles don't necessarily address the problems that they had. And I think there needs to be more done to make vehicles better. I think at the moment, they're just not durable enough, as you said. But irrespective of that, it's all the other penalties that you have to account for. They're just, again, in a game where you have essentially trained the player base to accept few compromises, vehicles represent one too many compromises. And I think that is one of the core problems that people have with it. I don't think people are willing to take vehicles because there's just far too many negatives and not enough positives. And lastly, I think in a lot of instances they are also overpointed. I think that's the other hilarious thing about it. It's like, you know, to use the storm speeders as the example, the best version of the storm speeder was the hammerhand. It's the one with the triple melter gun and the missiles and all that stuff. I think that thing at one point was coming in at 170, 180 points. They've reduced it now. I think it's more like 155. But that thing was not as good as free attack bikes. And okay, fair enough, attack bikes are relatively similar to vehicles, but they're not vehicles, they're attack bikes. And, you know, I think this is the thing. I feel like they've done one too many things to reduce the efficiency of vehicles. Like, I mean, how many tanks do you know with a core keyword anymore? I mean, I mean,
well,
few I can think of. Not that that's relevant to armies that haven't established the core keyword.
Well, exactly. So you're talking about AdMech, you're talking about Space Marines. I don't think they have any of them do. I think maybe the Honored Dragoon Corps. I don't think it does, but I think it has data tether, which can sometimes give it an ability which is similar-ish to core. And this is the thing. I think they've sort of nerfed vehicles that pumps up dreadnoughts. And I think that's why it's sort of easy to make a comparison of these are good and they're popular. You know, in a Marine army, people will take Redemptor Dreads or any kind of dreadnought almost for days because they've just got so much going for them. The fact that they've got core so they can get rerolls, the fact that through a stratagem they can give themselves a reroll aura of ones to hit or ones to wound through the Wisdom of the Ancient stratagem. They've all got -1 damage, which is huge. And it sort of feels like at the very least, -1 damage should be applied to all their vehicles, but I don't think it is. The other thing is they're just really good in combat as well. And dreadnoughts, yes, should be better than a tank in combat, but I actually think one of the biggest flaws is that vehicles should be good in combat. And I think you are starting to see that with the new 9th edition codexes where like the weapon skill or the number of attacks that tanks get has gone up, even if it's very subtly. And I look forward to seeing what they do with the Lehman Russ. At the moment, they hit on 6s and they get like a flat 3 attacks, D3, then 1 attack. But if they change that to weapon skill 3 or 4, I mean, we were just saying about weapon skill 3 being unheard of. But for a big, massive tank, you would expect it to have actually a pretty decent weapon skill. Yeah, there's the Crush Them stratagem, which can make it to a 2+. But that's like 1 vehicle per turn, and you have to have charged. So yeah, I think, you know, more attacks, make them more deadly, give their tracks like an AP value, for example, so to represent the crushing weight that they're just driving over things. And you know, you've mentioned it plenty of times in the past. You used to love the ability to charge vehicles and make people like run away. What was the term for that?
You're talking about tank shock specifically, which was a really interesting rule that very few people utilized, but had some really potent potential in game.
But that in itself was to try and represent the fear and the sort of devastating ability that vehicles or tanks in particular could do. And that is very much like a kind of real world military history kind of comparison. And that's sort of been sucked out of the current iteration of vehicles. I mean, you know, I see people all the time just going how much they want things like tank facings or like firing arcs to come back. You know, a way of representing the strength of the armor on the front. So the front armor value should be somehow stronger than the back. And I think that was one of the biggest shocks going from 7th to 8th was, you know, the fact that vehicles can shoot everywhere. Even if I've got a side sponson on the left, it can shoot on the right. You've got to do some initial mental gymnastics to get around it and like justify it in your head, because it does break the immersion of the game. And you kind of go, oh, as it's moving, it's turning around and shooting. Okay, I sort of get it at a push. And in a way, you know, I don't mind that, because I think the simplicity of the shooting phase now is probably better for the game you're not arguing about whether you hit the corner of a tank that was slightly more to the front or the corner of it that was slightly more to the side to get a slightly weaker side facing. So I think taking those elements out of the game while losing a lot of thematic elements to it does make for a more streamlined game.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do understand the decision to remove the armor values, even if it is that I'm not overly in favor of that decision. And I do understand the decision to remove the facings. Again, anything that mechanically creates less opportunities for debate is always really important. And I think anything that Games Workshop can do to create a system that streamlines things is good. Though I still feel like when streamlining, we should still be aspiring to, keep the kind of spirit of these kind of mechanics alive, and that we should still be aspiring to kind of create moments of immersion or moments of gameplay which feel like they reflect some kind of real life situation. I think one of the things about the armor facings and the armor values that I really missed was the idea that, if I have armor 11, a strength 4 weapon cannot do anything to me. And I think what was really interesting about that is that, again, it created the requirement to have those anti-tank weapons in your army because you had to account for that as a possibility. And I think there needs to be some considerations made about how do we enter into a situation where, certain weapons are not absurdly efficient. Because again, right, to put it in context, if you are a 10 wound tank, which I believe is the amount of wounds a rhino has, but maybe it has 11, maybe it has 10. But let's say for the sake of argument that it's got 10 wounds, because again, I can't remember accurately. 10 wounded rhinos die to 5 heavy bolter shells getting through. And it is not outside of the realms of possibility for 5 heavy bolter shells to do it, because a unit of say like 4 devastators will fire, or rather 5 devastators, 4 of which having heavy bolters, will fire out 12 shots. 12 shots hit on 3s. So you're going to hit 9, and then they wound on 5s, which is 1 in 3 odds. So you're going to probably wound. Well, I suppose actually in this example, you're going to wound 3 times, aren't you? So you're fine. So you wound 3 times, and then you will probably fail. Let's just be really generous and say you fail 2 armor saves. We've taken 4 wounds, right? Like, okay, fair enough. You're not dead, but you've taken a significant chunk of damage from anti-personnel weapons. And I think that's the problem. I think in a situation where Games Workshop have essentially created a situation where 2 wound models are relatively prevalent, they've then balanced that by increasing the amount of 2 damage weapons that are available. But then 2 damage weapons essentially create a situation where vehicles with 10 wounds are pretty insignificant, right?
And this is where that -1 damage abilities sort of been brought in to sort of patch that problem, because they've gone, lots of things now are 2 damage, like heavy bolters is the main one. And as you say, they're designed really for, I mean, yes, they could be used taking out light vehicles. I wouldn't even say necessarily a rhino is a light vehicle. It's, it's a medium-sized tank. It's not something like a sentinel, which I would say is more of a light vehicle, or an open-top vehicle. Like all the elder vehicles should be really light vehicles. So yeah, it can kind of wound it on a decent amount. It's not improbable. Whereas maybe in editions past, it was much harder for them to wound or do any kind of significant damage to vehicles, if at all. And yeah, it's just now doing a lot more damage. And it's weird that they've given the -1 to certain things like dreadnoughts, but not to all vehicles. And I think if they gave it to all vehicles, that would almost solve one of the biggest problems that the game's sort of having right now. because it fixes everything that's gotten 2 damage or gone up in firepower, but it also helps them against some of the bigger weapons, like even a lasgun. You know, a -1 on that, not insignificant. So that would make. I mean, maybe one of the options is give them like double wounds. You know, a rhino, give it 20 wounds. Like, would that then make it a bit more of a powerhouse on the battlefield? It's like you still have things like eradicators that could, in probably 1 turn, blow it off the table. Because eradicators will probably blow most things off the table turn 1. But, you know, it would make it a lot more hard work. And I think the thing is, if you got a squad or 2 of dedicated anti-tank shooting a vehicle, yeah, probably should die if it's a basic tank. But it shouldn't die to stuff that aren't really designed for taking out tanks. I think that's the main issue.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? To your point, it's like las guns or things like, I mean, always things like, it's always grots that do it in my experience, like Gretchens, you know, like the little dudes with their grotzukas or whatever they're called, like the tiny little handguns that are strength 2. And you're like, I'm going to shoot you with 10 of these. Oh, I've done 3 wounds to your tank. It's like, right, yeah, of course, makes sense. But yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like the light firearms doing that is it's an interesting problem, and it becomes one of those situations where they are definitely starting to add mechanics to the game, or to, you know, use mechanics that could definitely start to work to the benefit of tanks, and things that could definitely be added to make the vehicle more impactful. I mean, I think when it comes to the solutions or the things that I would definitely prioritize, I think, well, okay, there were a few problems, again, that I feel like we probably still need to lay the groundwork for, which is, I think one of the other unique problems with vehicles are the design principles behind those vehicles. And to clarify what I mean, I think we are in a situation where there is some lag in terms of the style of vehicles that are available out there, the value of the chassis, and then the value of the weapons placed upon it. So I think there is a lot of instances where there are vehicles still prevalent within the game that have a very, very, very low weapon count. So even things like a Lehman Russ, right? The Lehman Russ has got its 1 big turret, it's got its 1 hull weapon, and then you've got the option of sponsons. Now, that, in all respects, has been for the longest time a heavily armored vehicle, or rather heavily, heavily armed vehicle.
And,
right?
It was until the Primaris Repulsor, I think, came along to be like, no, this is how you do mass shooting battle tanks.
Yes, but again, it creates one of these weird situations where more modern vehicles are becoming more heavily laden with weapons, and they then start to introduce a lot more efficiency, because all of a sudden you have the chassis which attributes this many points because this is the chassis, and then you have the weapons which are exponentially less expensive. So effectively, when you're ending up in situations where you have a chassis that's worth 200 points, and then you end up putting 100 points worth of weapons on there, you end up obviously with a 300-point vehicle. Whereas in other instances, you have the same 200-point chassis with weapons numbering, 50 points or 40 points worth of weapons. So you have a 240-point vehicle. And even if you had 2 of those vehicles, you would end up in a situation where you would be paying, say, 500 points, say, for the 2 versions of this vehicle, but their firepower or their output wouldn't even equal that of one of the 300-point vehicles. And I think that's where the game becomes quite interesting, because vehicles have all these different kind of design ideas and different aesthetics. And, I think the elder vehicles have often benefited from the fact that they've all got a lot of weapons on them, but now they are, less so. And, other vehicles have less weapons on them. And I just, again, it's one of those situations where I think there's an inconsistency in terms of the design principles, and I think one of the other things is that the chassis are heavily pointed, but you end up in situations where the survivability of the chassis is probably the least admirable part of the vehicle. It's like, because what does a chassis being alive, what does a vehicle being alive do in a game of Warhammer 40,000 9th edition? The answer is not a great deal. In a lot of instances, it works to the benefit of your opponent. You know, one of the major issues of the Rhino is it doesn't possess any weapons that would scare someone from tagging it. So you bring a Rhino to the table, all you're doing is offering your opponent an opportunity to stand next to something that prevents you from interacting with it, you know, the unit that stands next to it at all. So I literally go, oh, cool, Rhino, wicked. I'm just going to stand next to it now. Cool. Now you have to either, you know, your Rhino either has to step off, of which, why wouldn't it? Because it gains no benefit. But it's just that thing. It's there's nothing good that can happen by bringing a Rhino necessarily, other than maybe a bit of movement.
Yeah,
but...
I mean, you yourself could use it to tag their units in combat, but like you're saying, it can quite easily happen the other way around. I remember playing, this was in 8th edition, playing an Orc player, and I had my Hellhounds up front, because obviously you would. I can't remember if he did it turn 1, but pretty much like straight away he managed to, maybe it would have been turn 2. So I got a turn of shooting. He then basically got a decent charge off on my tanks, wrapped them, but didn't really pile in. He did that cheeky tactic of, I'll make sure 1 or 2 is actually in combat with your unit, and then the rest are all out of range, so he can't kill it in his turn, because he could then sort of either kill it in later turns himself, or just to then slingshot up the board, which I think he did with one of them. But then with one of the others, he was quite happy to be in combat with it, because it's like, it's a tank. In that edition, it couldn't shoot in combat, and it just meant he could sit on an objective. And I was like, oh, right, I kind of gave that to him there. I didn't really think about that too much. So, you know, those sorts of things do happen. When it comes to your point about points, what's interesting, and I was thinking about it, is the points for a heavy bolter on a vehicle tend to pretty much be the same points as they are on an infantry unit. And it's like, yes, the infantry unit is weaker, especially if it's a heavy weapons squad. But if it's in a 10-man unit, it's pretty well protected and will shoot to maximum efficiency every single turn until that model's dead. A 10-point heavy bolter on a Lehman Russ is only worth those 10 points for a turn or two until it's taken a couple of points of damage, and then you've degraded your shooting ability by a third, because you'll go from 4s to 5s, and instantly that 10-point heavy bolter is not worth the paper that it's written down on. And then, you know, you go down to your lowest bracket, then you're hitting on 6s, and it's like, well, that's pointless at that point. So I think the degrading mechanic, I get why they did it. It sort of feels very thematic. It's like big things going around at max efficiency, even on 1 wound, for example, is a bit of a pain. Although with the pretty much most things, bar maybe the guard, I mean, actually no, maybe they do now have an ability to put that vehicle back on top profile for a turn anyway. So they're kind of undoing the whole point of the degrading profile by making it cost CP to run them at max strength. So it's like, it's a bit of a weird one. It sort of it feels much more thematic for monsters. It feels much more thematic for Age of Sigmar, which is where it first came in, I believe. But for vehicles, it just seems like such a weird one. Like, why is my ability for the guy in the tank to shoot suddenly gone down because I've taken some holes in the tank? It's like the old table of old where you could roll on the damage table, and it's like, oh, a weapon's blown up, or my tracks have been blown up so I can't move. They were much more thematic, but they were sort of like a bit more of a pain to manage, keep track of, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think too many people would necessarily reminisce overly fondly about the old
not
rules in
at
terms
all,
of.
because I always found I would constantly you'd always be crew shaken anyway, which for a lot of tanks, you can then shoot your ordnance weapons anyway, which is what a battle cannon or a Medusa, for example, was. So most of the time, you can't even shoot those weapons. So they're better than what they were, but even back in 6th edition, they weren't that great.
No, I think that's the thing, though. I think I think you need to come up with some kind of mechanic that offers or creates a reduction in quality. But I think the problem is that, again, it's sort of weird that you've just constrained this mechanic to vehicles and monsters, admittedly, some big monsters, but it's a weird thing that you've kind of added to it that doesn't necessarily communicate the point as well as you might want it to. I suppose an interesting way of approaching this film, and something that might be fun to just kind of as a thought exercise. I mean, at this moment in time, within the boundaries of tanks specifically, would you assert if there are any objectively good tanks? I mean, is there anything that you're seeing in the the world of tanks that actually could qualify as being useful? Because I mean, when I look at, say, like the Space Marine tanks, it's difficult for me to kind of assert that any of those are especially strong, right? Like, I think there is some interesting gimmicks with some of the older tanks. I think the Hunter and the Stalker, which are the anti-aircraft tanks, have got some interesting nonsense. But I think that's only because people get caught unawares by them. I think the Whirlwind has some play because of its artillery functionality. I think the fact that you can obviously lay down firepower out of line of sight is a benefit to the Whirlwind. But in terms of the Gladiators, the new tanks that they've added there, I really struggle to understand or, consider what the viability is of them. I want the Gladiators to be good. I think the Gladiators are gorgeous miniatures. I think the idea of running, gladiator tanks in a Space Marine army should be cool, but the problem is at the moment is I just don't really understand what they do beyond, float about and, not do a great deal else, I guess. I don't know. I mean, are there any tanks that you can think of that... I have thought of one. That new Sisters of Battle tank is pretty good.
Castigator.
The one with the auto cannons and the heavy bolters and stuff.
Yeah, what I like about that vehicle, it's a new one, but it's kind of sticking to the old classic kind of design principles of the Imperium. You've got a whole mounted weapon at the front. You've got your sponsons. You've got your big battle cannon or turret weapon. Maybe it's for 2 auto cannons and a pintle mount on it. It's not overloaded with weapons like some of the Primaris ones are. And I think even some of the Primaris ones, I think the Repulsor was a bit egregious. It was a bit over the top with the number of guns on that one. And everything else, they've kind of pulled back a little bit. So the Gladiator tanks, as you mentioned, don't really have as many. The land speeders, or is it storm speeders, the new ones?
Storm speeders,
again, they don't have a huge amount of guns. I mean, they've got a lot. They've got like a main gun, sponsons, and a maybe like a secondary top mounted one, like with the missiles and stuff. But that's probably like 1 or 2 weapons more than their older variants. So maybe they do. But yeah, the Castigator I think is a good one. Design wise, it's pretty good. And do you just like it for the fact that it's got loads of DACA?
Yeah, well, the reason why I think it's got some options is because it's a very, it's built around a specific kind of archetype. It's like they go, cool. The idea of this is that it has an abundance of heavy bolters and it has an abundance of, autocannons, and there's definitely some things that you can do with this. And I think that's kind of the thing that's sort of like, it's immediately obvious to me what the what the function is of this vehicle, and it's obviously got some good weapons. Again, though, I don't think Sisters players are utilizing it. I don't think it's a unit that the Sisters players are prioritizing, but it is a unit that I think, could qualify as a good tank in the modern sense of it all.
True. I mean, it's been out like 2 weeks, so I think.
Has it only been out 2
Yeah,
weeks? That might
was,
quantify what is coming there then.
I think it went out for pre-order last weekend, or maybe the weekend before.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty
so
new.
It's not even like a week old.
Yeah, it's
okay.
Hasn't been
Well, it's
around
too
that long.
soon then. It's too soon then to assert if this tank is good or not. Then, but or rather, if people are using it. But I definitely remember when we went through the stats and I read it that I was a bit like, oh yeah, that seems like a cool tank for what it was. But yeah, outside of that though, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really. There's no tanks in particular that I can think of at the moment that really kind of made me go, oh yeah, gotta have that one.
Yeah, I mean, as a guard tank, there's like a couple of that are getting a lot of play in the kind of competitive scene. And it's not necessarily that they're good, it's just this is the best combo that you can do. So tank commanders in terms of Lehman Russes is by far the best because they've got ballistic skill 3+. They can give themselves orders for a reroll 1 to hit. Obviously, you can also give them other orders, so potentially reroll the number of dice. I think if you're an action order now, I'm just trying to even think because Kajans get reroll 1s natively if they don't move. Kachan get reroll number of shots natively due to their regiment trait. So there's different ways of buffing their output slightly, but predominantly it's tank commander. Everyone's just taking demolished tanks nowadays because they're just so good. It's like they're 24-inch range, so they are a bit shorter, and that is a bit of a hindrance. Always turn 1 in the game, especially if you go first, I find, just because then they might not have range to the targets they actually want. But they're like strength 10 -4, I think, d6 damage, and then you use the Hail of Fire stratagem on them, which only works against vehicles, but you get maximum number of shots, and you're shooting twice because of grinding advance. So that's 12, shots that are better than las cannons to the face of something. It's like it's so good to the point where it's a bit broken, if I'm honest. Like it, but it feels like that's like a real crutch that they need to make their army even viable because everything's sort of so out of date and the power creep of everything else is so much higher. So it's like that's one way of playing a tank to its most efficient ability, to the exclusion of all other variant of Lehman Russ. It's like that is the one that you will take. In terms of artillery, everyone takes manticores. It used to be basilisks with a vigilist attachment ability, and I think aerial spotter to get rerolls on one of them, or with tank aces, but everyone soon moved over to manticores. Manticores, I think, can fire 4 times max in a game because each of their rockets is 1 shot only, but it's 2d6 shots per turn. And I believe it's strength 10. Hold on, let me just double check. Yeah, strength 10 -2 d3 damage. It's got blast as well. But then you give it the full payload tank ace, which makes it flat free. So having something that flat free is super good. And people just tend to take 2 of those. And again, it just feels like none of the vehicles on their own are that good. You need stratagems or tank aces to sort of buff them to be better. It will be interesting to see what I do with like battle cannons going forwards, whether they become flat free damage, which is something we've sort of speculated based on other battle cannons of various names getting similar buffs. I mean, it's not necessarily good, but things like Bane Blades are fun. Like super heavy tanks are fun because they're really good in combat. They can shoot all their guns. They've got lots of wounds, so they don't degrade as much. They're a lot more survivable. It's like, yeah, they draw a lot more firepower. But yeah, as you said before, they really struggle just moving around the board. especially nowadays, like on modern 9th edition tables.
I think the Baneblade is probably one of the most penalized when it comes to that movement stipulation. I mean, that is because they're massive, right?
Yeah.
Like, so the idea of moving those around is an absolute nightmare, isn't it? Given the size of the board and so on.
Like even back in, I'm trying to think where I did. I think it was even in 8th edition at Warhammer World, and these are very sparsely populated. In fact, they weren't always, but there were times where I would be stuck with my Baneblade. Like someone would either move block me or just lock me in combat, and it's like I can't fall back because my back's to some trees or something and I can't go through them, or a ruin or something. And I remember there were times where I was locked in combat with something and it's like, okay, cool, but I can still shoot my weapons outside of combat. But everything sort of near me was also in combat, and everything that was out of combat was literally behind buildings that I couldn't shoot through. So it's like my Baneblade spent several turns of the game stuck in combat, unable to shoot anything. And it was like such a frustrating game. Because you can't just move through anything, and you can't really do enough damage in combat to kill like 30 bloodthirsters or bloodletters, or I think in this instance it was plague bearers.
Yeah, sounds about right, mate. I mean, I've had games as well where I have kind of also move blocked Baneblade chassis miniatures, and obviously
was that with your 12 flyers?
Yes, yeah, that did happen. Yeah, I mean, I've been in games though where people have I played against a guy who was rocking 3 shadow swords, and he just basically put himself in a situation where these shadow swords could not move, and it was like, oh, you mucked that up, didn't you? He's like, yeah, I've parked everything in a weird way, and now I'm stuck. I'm like, okay. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think the current problem is with vehicles for me is just that I think it's a combination of elements. There's no real standout USP. And again, I know we've focused on the tank in this instance, but I think a lot of these issues apply to a number of them. Because again, the game is so objective heavy. So, I mean, based on like that, what is it that we can do to a vehicle that vehicle keyword gives this? What fixes it? Is it OBSEC? Because vehicles with OBSEC seems theoretically abusive, but
you can
at the same
give
time,
it to Lehman Russes via a spearhead detachment, and it does work sometimes. I sort of feel like it should be a bit more like knights with a relic or some kind. So it's like OBSEC plus counts as 5 models or counts as 3 models, something other than 1 model. Like the fact that they're OBSEC is cool. I'd rather it just count as like 5 models, for example. Doesn't even need OBSEC. Like, I think just count as 5 models would be cool. Count as 5 models and OBSEC, awesome. Don't give that to every vehicle, maybe, but definitely give it to, your main, I would say, core, but battle line unit that you might be rocking. So, maybe you'd give that to Land Raiders, maybe you'd give it to Lehman Russes, but you wouldn't give it to Rhinos and Chimeras, for example.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I think, again, I think for me, the solution to the situation needs to be a universal kind of vehicle stipulation, but I do understand how maybe you don't need to apply it to everything. But again, that becomes one of those kind of nuances. I think something that makes it play in the objective space.
Yeah.
Maybe not the flyers. Maybe obviously the aircraft still need the same stipulation. I mean, the aircrafts are themselves their own weird sort of problems at the moment because, again, it becomes one of those things of firepower is obviously good but not ridiculous, and then the fact that you can't interact with a good chunk of the game really kind of reduces their efficiency, I suppose. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, you could, if you were, let's say you're going to give all vehicles OBSEC, or you're going to give all vehicles a number of models that they represent, you could do it via vehicles, well, the vehicle keyword with 10 or less count as 5. Over 10 count as 10 models. So you can easily give like a power scale to small vehicles, big vehicles, and how that's represented on the board when it comes to capturing objectives. Something like that.
Yeah. No, I do understand what you're saying.
I mean, another option is, and this isn't actually this would be a complete rewrite of the game, unfortunately. But maybe weapons need to have different profiles based on whether they're attacking infantry or vehicles. I believe Bolt Action has something like this. They've got different stats based on whether you're attacking infantry or whether you're attacking vehicles. So, let's say Heavy Bolter, Strength 5. Was it -2 AP, 2 damage? Or was it -1 AP?
Oh God, -1. I
Hold
think
on. I've got the app right in front of me. Why don't I
get the app? I'll
spend some money and actually see what
spend some beans,
or more likely get the most out of it. Heavy Bolter -1, 2 damage.
Yes.
So
yes.
And against infantry, keep that profile, but maybe against the vehicles it's AP-1 damage, for example, or just either changing the AP against vehicles and infantry to have 2 different stats, or maybe changing the damage characteristic based on whether it's infantry or vehicles.
Well, I thought there was with the Beast Snagger rules that they added around the idea that you could only wound it on 4s unless you were strength 8 or more. I think there is certainly something that could be looked at there. Like maybe you only wound it on 6 unless you're strength 8 or more, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the ramshackle rule.
Yeah. No, the ramshackle rule is -1. I'm talking about it was a Beast Snagger just culture,
okay,
basically.
yeah. So because ramshackle was -1 damage if it was
but
under strength 8. Yeah,
you're right. Actually, yeah. Sorry, yeah, you're absolutely right because they extends to the strength 8 stipulation. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is different ways of going about it, and maybe that sort of rule would fix it. But that is effectively just a -1 damage, but not as good. You could say, I don't know, would you want to go all vehicles can't be wounded better than a 3+, for example? It doesn't actually solve a lot of the problems, because the things.
No, I'm not saying a 3+. I'm saying all vehicles can't be wounded on anything other than a 6 unless your strength 8.
Right, okay, yeah, that would sort of solve the inherent problem of anti-infantry weapons just wounding vehicles too easily, and most of the time they're wounding on 5s, but it's like they get such a volume of firepower or the ability to re-roll their wound roll or get +1 to wound, for example. They kind of go around, they're working around all the inherent stress defensive of the vehicle. But then at the same time, you're sort of almost completely eroding the strength toughness system at that point. But maybe it would work as a universal thing.
Again, and I agree with you. I think, ultimately, we do have to acknowledge that these changes could be drastic and could have a very real impact on the overall balance of the game. But again, it just sort of feels more and more like something needs to be done to, to I don't know, just ever so slightly address these points, right? Like, just something needs to happen somewhere.
Yeah,
surely.
I mean, one thing I've always said is just give us a universal stratagem so 1 vehicle per turn can fall back and shoot still. That just seems like a pretty reasonable thing to ask for. Just as a simple get out of jail free card for 1 vehicle, I think, per turn, like as a strat. I think that'd be a nice fix for the combat issue. Obviously, you can still shoot into combat, so that was nice. But the fact that you can still get tagged and it's like, oh, cool, I can't do anything. Quite often, if you're running tank-heavy games, by the end, like you've got 2 or 3 vehicles just constantly in combat. You fall back, they charge you the following turn. and it's like a daisy chain effect where you're just not doing anything for a few turns and they're just so chipping wounds off you. And that is, again, one of those like sort of feel bad moments where a lot of the stratagems that they introduced in 9th edition were actually to get around those kind of mechanical feel bad moments, like, wrapping and trapping, killing all the crew inside, or killing all the transported units inside transport by just completely wrapping it and destroying it, stuff like that. They've kind of given you stratagems to kind of work around those systems that are happening in the game.
Yeah, gotcha.
I think overall it's just that there's lots of small things that really need to be changed. Something to improve its durability, ideally something to help it get around the board a bit better, or to kind of compensate it for the fact that the boards are now much more terrain heavy and vehicles are quite big. Increase its durability both from weapons, especially 2 damage weapons, potentially letting it interact with cover. What I'd almost like to see is almost maybe let it grant cover to infantry, like hiding behind it, for example. Because I did it in one game ages ago where I think I was playing Richard and it was early 8th edition. I'd lined up all my tanks right on the deployment zone and I'd hidden all my infantry behind the vehicles. So they were out, and I'd boxed like all the vehicles because I didn't have sponsons on them, all the Lehman Russes like together. So it kind of formed a wall, and I had all my infantry hidden behind, like from line of sight, so you couldn't shoot at them. And I remember posting a picture up on Instagram, and someone was like saying, "Oh, someone actually playing vehicles how they're meant to be done in real world," because that's exactly what happened in, like, even from World War One, you'd have vehicles going up and infantry sort of hiding behind them, sort of in like little columns. And I knew eventually once he would get closer, I could sort of split my tanks out and the infantry can funnel through the gaps and actually form a that kind of shield wall that you need, that kind of little bubble wrap protective nature, so they weren't getting tagged. So something that allows them to do stuff like that would be a nice touch, but not required. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, it's stuff like the cheaper points, stronger firepower potentially, or in the case of things like battle cannons, just a more consistent output of fire, because a D6 number of shots is just too random. And then, yeah, lastly, I guess it's the ability to interact with objectives a bit better, or take objectives.
Yeah, it's an extensive list, right? And I think, at the core of it all, I think the most bizarre thing is the fact that there are so many interesting ideas that you could convey around vehicles. It's not like you couldn't come up with some interesting ideas. It's just seemingly that they're not engaging with that. And I think that's the shame of it. It's like there is definitely more that can be done to make vehicles interesting in 40k. And it feels to me that they are effectively doing they're doing the bare minimum. They are simplifying the mechanics. They are ultimately creating a situation where they're not being interesting with this stuff, or they're not really pushing it as far as it could go.
It sort of feels like they've got it right with the dreadnoughts for Space Marines and potentially other dreadnoughts for other factions. It feels like that was like a really good sweet spot for them. And that was only really by changing, giving it extra durability by the -1 damage, and then they just competitively pointed them. And dreadnoughts inherently get around a lot of the combat mechanics and damage output by, their core. They can do well in combat, for example. Yeah, they can't sit on objectives. But they've already solved like 3 of the like 5 problems that vehicles have. So it's they have done it. They just sort of need to apply that kind of logic and push it a bit more for all the other vehicles.
Agreed. And hopefully one day they might. But until then, I imagine that'll do for this film. What do you think?
Yeah,
that'll do, Pig. All right. Transitional noise. Woo! All right, guys, it's the end of the show, but you know better than that. We're going to talk for a little bit longer. How do you feel like the episode went in the general sense, Phil? I have to be honest. When we recorded yesterday, and that's where we did the 2 main segments, I was totally zonked. I was really out of my tree. So I don't know how that will have come across. I feel a lot more sprightly and a lot more kind of with it right now. So I'm hopeful that, my ongoing professionalism when it comes to talking at great lengths about Warhammer 40,000 mask the fact that I don't think I did a very good job this episode.
Well, you might not be getting those calls for those adverts to do the voiceovers.
No. Noting that obviously at this point, me and Phil have just finished recording the intro, where we had a lovely, heartwarming message, which really knocked me for 6, really, because I'm used to a bit more of a kind of comedy angle on it. There was one lad who left us a 5-star review in America recently, which I guess we'll get around to calling out within the proper protocols of things. And I never know whether to sort of read it as he genuinely doesn't like it, but has left us a 5-star review because he thinks it'll be funny to have us have to read it out, or there's a degree of cynicism to the whole thing. I'm, glass half full about it and assuming that when he says this podcast is awful, I hate it, 5 stars, that he actually means that he actually quite enjoys it. But he's kind of playing along with our ongoing desire for people to slag us off in the 5-star review segment, because I'm pretty sure we have said that on multiple occasions. Like, come on, tell us off in the 5-star review, it'd be funny.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that has been the case. I'm sure if someone really, I don't know, like you could take the angle of he doesn't like the podcast, wants to give it a 1-star review, but also wants it read out. So who knows? It's
the power of the segment, though, Phil. You see, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you write. It's all about the numbers, right? You got to fuel that algorithm. That's what we love.
That's true. I hope people don't think that he suddenly skipped the queue because you've sort of read his review out already.
Well, no, I've not uttered his name. I've not given
it its proper due.
Exactly. He'll get that eventually when we get around to it. These things will happen at some point in the future, as they so often do. But yeah, no, overall, I actually thought it was all right. It was fun talking about the stat lines and trying to determine all the 2+ related issues and the vehicle conversation. I've got a lot of ideas and a lot of thoughts and feelings about both topics, and I never know necessarily how to articulate them in the best possible way. I think often when you do segments like that, you feel like you leave a lot of things unsaid, but irrespective of that, I think we got the kind of point across for both, which is that we don't really understand why there is an abundance of 2+ to hit, given the way the game feels like it should be balanced. And equally, we would like to see things done to make vehicles more impactful in the game, because they feel like they should have more, impact than they do presently.
Yeah, it's very hard to understand the mindset of the designers. That's why I like the White Dwarf articles, where they do talk about the philosophy behind certain reasons, and actually initially you can be quite critical of something, and even when it comes to they used to do it more in the weekly versions of White Dwarf, where you'd see a design of something, you'd be like, this is rubbish, what's this about? And then they would actually go through and explain the reasons why things look a certain way, like what this piece of armor means or piece of equipment does. And when you see that, you get it.
Yeah, sorry to try and interrupt you there, mate, but do they still do loads of dev interviews on Warhammer Live? I have to admit, I've really checked out on Warhammer Live. Warhammer Live was such a hot ticket 4 years ago. When they started introducing it, I would watch Warhammer Live religiously, pay the subscriptions all the time, really get into it. But yeah, I haven't really religiously watched any of the Warhammer Live stuff. Do they still do Q&As with
honestly,
designers?
I don't think they do. I think, as far as I'm aware, they do their hobby roundup is the main one that they still do. And they do, I'm trying to think, they occasionally do stuff, but obviously they do games, but sort of in a weird remote way. I haven't honestly watched one in few months, to be honest. But yeah, I did used to like their kind of Q&As, and they always tended to do it around the time of a release of a codex or a battle tome. You tend to still now get them. So when AOS 3 dropped, they had a couple of like designer and artist interviews, but that was also on YouTube as well, and on Warhammer Community. I think a lot of that just gets funneled through to the Warhammer Community site now, so a lot less of that is on Twitch. I also think it's, maybe it's because it's well, I think there's two reasons. One, because everyone's working remotely from home, so it's not as easy to do. I think also they actually tend to save those kind of chats for the big reveals. So when they're showcasing new events, I think there's got to be another con coming up soon. I can't remember if it's Gen Con. There is another American one coming up, so I'm sure we'll get another round of reveals coming. And occasionally they do good interviews there. Like whenever they roll out Dan Abnett off of his throne and bring him on, his interviews, wherever you find them, are just fantastic. Obviously he's a Black Library author, not a designer, but it's been a while since we've heard old Jez on the telly box. He's always good to listen to as well.
Yeah, it's weird because I'm just sifting through their old community podcasts just to try and get a flavor for the personalities and things they get to attend those. And yeah, it's very much here's Chris Peachy, here's Nick Baton, here's Louise. Like, there's not really seemingly, or at least not in recent memory, any real kind of efforts to add people outside of the community team.
It sort of makes sense that they've kind of kept it internal to their own team. Potentially they're just all busy, like working. So who knows sort of why the reasons are. And I guess potentially that might just be like a sort of, when they were doing it, a bit of a holding pattern, because the Warhammer Plus stuff is coming down the line. So obviously Wade's doing his Lore Masters, so he's probably working on that in the background. And obviously there's the new guy doing the battle reports.
Oh, did you see the dislike ratio on those? On those kill team videos?
On YouTube or on Facebook?
On YouTube, man. Like, so those kill team videos, they got panned.
Well, I mean, he's no Becca Scott. I think they sort of set the bar very high early doors with Becca Scott doing those videos, and she's fantastic at that job. I mean, that is her job, and she's been doing it for years for a bunch of other companies as well. So those are really good quality ones. I think I enjoyed it when Nick Baton did them as well. He's got a very enthusiastic charm to it. I can't actually. I don't even know the new guy's name.
Lad with the tattoos who did the
Warzone Moloch. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he seems like a lovely bloke. I mean, it's just interesting how the community sort of like, and I don't know if it's a reflection on their opinions of him as an individual, or whether it's a reflection on the reception to the game. Like, I don't know whether it's people being underwhelmed by Kill Team.
I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it's a bit more to do with the general backlash about the whole Games Workshop IP thing that's going on in the background. And I suspect it's people just downvoting anything that Games Workshop puts out. I showed you earlier. I'm trying to remember what I even shared. It was a 40K. It was a Warhammer community post, and yeah, again, it just had a massive angry. This was on Facebook, so it had loads and loads of angry faces, way more than the thumbs up, and that was to do with the post that they put out today. Let's have a quick look.
Okay. Well, fair enough. I mean, I can understand the root of the sort of frustration.
Just to interrupt, the thing that I'd shared, it was Warhammer 40K's post about Warhammer Plus launching this month. They basically re-put out a post which is very similar to one they did previously, just sort of reiterating all the amazing stuff that it's got. And at the time I took a screenshot, it had 161 angry faces and 135 thumbs up.
Wow.
Also had a couple of heart emojis and some laughing emojis and 2 sad emojis as well.
There we go. On the topic of our non-profit status, this was obviously a broader conversation that we had kicked off in the intro segment that was probably worth touching on here, which is at this time of the year, kind of August, September time, me and Phil start to realize that we're, within shooting distance of the end of the year. And this is about the time where me and Phil, previously me, Phil and Joe, have a bit of a round table, as it were, talking about future plans for the pod, what we want to do with it, how we feel about it, what we think our kind of future aspirations are, what our personal circumstances are looking like. And obviously the world as it is now has afforded us the ability to do weekly content, and the cash flow has been such that it has been something that we feel comfortable paying for out of our own pocket. But there are conversations that we're trying to weigh up at the moment in terms of how best to proceed with it. We're considering going back to a fortnightly format in 2022, simply because of the likelihood of us needing to return to offices and needing to balance more kind of travel commitments and things. And the other thing that we've been toying around with is the potential of asking for those who want to support the show to not asking for them to do it, but presenting opportunities for those that want to support the show to be able to do so. So these are things we're thinking about. These are things that we're debating. We've always got pros and cons that rattle through our brains, because I think when it comes to the Patreon stuff, right, like the money stuff, we're always a little bit anxious about our overall kind of like commitment to it, but also more than anything, just the general kind of what we can do in return, right, Phil? I mean, that's always the thing, isn't it? It's sort of like, what can we offer beyond what we do already? And the answer we always come back to is not much, really. So that's something we're trying to kind of solve, because, yeah, I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about all the Patreon conversations at the moment, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I think, I think you're right. It's something we've obviously between the two of us we've talked about quite extensively. I think in terms of the ease of use for us to maintain it, it's like, on one hand, are we asking people to help us out sort of financially to run the podcast in return for something extra, i.e. backstage access, one-on-one live chats? If you look at a lot of patrons and how they work, there's a bunch of different offers that you can do, like tiered systems and things like that. I think for us, if we were to do it, we'd do the simplest option, which is there's no tiers, there's no behind the scenes, there's no nothing. Basically, if you want to donate something to help the running costs, brilliant. You can donate whatever you want, from the minimum of like $1 or whatever, the minimum that Patreon offers. Basically, that is what it will be. Nothing else will be there. And that is just to, because we don't have the time to do anything else in addition to the podcast, because it's quite extensive, time-wise on us. Weary souls. So I think that's all we would do. Obviously we've been talking about the idea of merch as well, and we do love those t-shirts that I toyed around with a while ago. So I'll kick my ass into gear, and I'll put some designs out for people to buy as well, that we would do probably by an independent retailer that we know that we would do. So I think those are the two sort of financial options we would do if we were going to do it. But I was going to say that the one perk that we could offer potentially, if we actually did have some finances going in, because Squadcast has like an extra fancy version where it doesn't allow us to just record audio but also video. So
yes,
if you wanted to see our hideous faces, you could. You can see me with my sort of scruffy hair that I've not combed properly for the day, and my shed with its, the ironing board that's got dogs on it in the background.
Exactly.
That's a lovely, nice, professional-looking studio that I've got here. Whereas Dan's
Yeah.
got a much nicer setup. He's all ready to be a Twitch streamer.
Well, yes, I mean that is true. That is true. But I am still incredibly ugly, mate. You forget that minor detail. That's how I was never going to make it in this world. No, that's the thing, though. I some kind of video content might be interesting and that kind of stuff. And again, for the sake of those listening at home, we just wanted to have a bit. We just wanted to give you an insight into our moral quandary at the moment, because we had this thought process months ago, years ago, where we were talking about doing the Patreon stuff, and inevitably it comes to the moment where we should push the button, and I just go, nah, I don't want to. I'm just literally, nah, don't worry about it. Actually, I just can't be bothered. Because the thing I hate, right? And this is the thing, I've turned down advertisers like crazy on this bloody thing, because we got quite popular this year, which has been amazing. And as a result, people come out of the woodwork all the time going like, oh, can I come on your show and promote this service? And like, no, you can't, because I've seen the podcast where, people who are flogging you a service turn up, and it's like turns into a weird interview show with someone that is completely boring. It's like, oh, I do this and you can buy this for me. Like, oh, great, cool. What an entertaining segment. But the, that kind of stuff, I'm just like, no. And then the idea of like doing live reads and all this other stuff that people do, and just like, nah, I can't be bothered with that either. So all that stuff I sort of say no to. But then I also get into this thing. But again, I'm one of those people. I'm convinced that people are going to, the minute we start doing a Patreon, and it will mention it like once or twice, and then people will be like, oh, you've sold out for the money. All you're interested in is the money. And I'll be like, oh, God. I'm just not sure my heart can take it, Phil. It's like...
Well, that's fair enough.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't know. We'll see what happens on that front. It's just one of those things where it is the moral quandary, because we're approaching a milestone, right? We're not even 2 episodes away now. After this is done, we're 1 episode away from episode 100. 1 episode from that rather spectacular milestone. And in our eyes, it's like, what better opportunity is there to launch something like a Patreon than the 100th episode? It's like, it's like a celebration to us. Yay! Shower us in your money. But
not sure that's quite the intention. It's more.
No, it's definitely not the intention.
Sort of, if you want to help us out supporting the show, brilliant.
Yeah. Well, the logic being is that we kind of feel like after over 3 years and 100 episodes, we kind of feel like we should have earned a certain level of credibility that people will understand that it's not really the goal. And then the aspiration always then is, I mean, again, it depends, because again, the problem is as well, right? And I just got to say it, the thought process someone like myself and Phil and people in our position go through is, when you've created something that's a little bit popular, your brain is racked constantly with how do you maintain it, or what are you doing? What's popular? How do you do this? And all the rest of it. And to a certain extent, I've kind of ignored a lot of that, but I do worry about it when it comes to like the Patreon stuff, because all of a sudden it becomes one of those things. It's like, how do I give value to people who are invested in us? Like, when all you're doing is downloading and listening to this free of charge, I don't really care what you think. I do, because I appreciate you and you're fantastic and thank you for listening. But in real terms, I don't meaningfully have to care. So when someone criticizes what we make, I could just be like, cool, don't listen. But the minute there's some kind of like financial incentive in there, it becomes a different thing. And, I worry about whether or not I become obsessed with like the cash flow of it all and how that works. And then also trying to, I don't know, it's just a weird process. It's a weird process. But, I am coming to the point where it's a lot of money every year and a lot of work and a lot of time. So I am kind of coming around to it, but I'm torn. But when we get to episode 100 and we announce that we're doing a Patreon, just realize that it's tortured me on the inside to agree to do this, even though I've also pushed to do it, which is the dynamic of this whole thing. It's like I don't know how you would describe it. It's like my bipolar coming through, Phil. It's like it's something very weird, right?
Is it a Trying to think of a suitable character, like an Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh on the outside and a Scrooge McDuck on the inside. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's probably what it is. Yeah. I'm Scrooge McDuck in an Eeyore costume. That's it. I don't know, because again, it's the thing, right? I mean, reviews like the one we read out today really hits a chord, right? And that's enough for me. Like I love when we get that sort of feedback, and there are so many instances where I've been buoyed by, my day has been made better by reading the feedback from the listeners, and that's great. That's a really positive thing to have in your life, and I'm really grateful for that. But at the same time, I don't know. It's a soul-searching scenario, much like tangent, Phil, but bringing it back, much like people's opinions on the new Emperor's Champion. Hey, do you like what I did there? Brought it back, got it back on the 40k train.
Yeah.
What do you think of the new Emperor's Champ?
That's all right. Yeah, it's
You really are sold on it, are you?
I don't know. I mean, if you're a Black Templars player, you should be quite over the moon. I got the impression that a lot of them weren't quite happy with it. General nitpicks that I saw online. The tabard was too long and it looks a bit weird wrapped around his leg. It looks like he's being tripped up. I kind of agree with that. The other one that was the sword was facing the wrong angle because it's blade edge, not edge, side being faced forwards, and people are like, it should be the edge shown because it's more of a strike down pose. However, I saw someone rightly point out that I think he's showing it up in the air like a relic to show off the inscription of the blade, and that's more what it's about. So I think on that point of view, it's pretty good.
I think when it comes to the positioning of the blade, I would have asserted, certainly with like the prayer beads that he's holding in his left hand, that this feels to me more like a kind of ceremonial sequence, like him, gearing up bloody hell, gearing up the Templars and leading them in prayer before the battle, which is a big part of the Emperor's Champion's ceremony. Like, when they first introduced the Emperor's Champion in, I want to say 4th edition, I could be right, I could be wrong. The prayer system was a really integral part of it, which was that you could pay points to give prayers to your army, and then those prayers would in turn unlock extra abilities for the Templars. And it was the Emperor's Champion that led those and was the kind of figurehead of that. So almost like, the scenes in war movies where the general, stands in front of the army and, works them up into a frenzy. I feel like this kind of has elements of that, where he's kind of using the symbol, the black sword, the weapon used by Sigismund, for God's sakes, in an attempt to rile up all the Templars and have them get into it, so to speak. So yeah, I don't know, I'm not too frustrated with the posing of that sword.
I think it would have been more impressive if they hadn't already released a Primaris Lieutenant in the exact same pose, which most Black Templars players already use to convert up their own Emperor's Champion. So this one doesn't. It obviously is a better version of the original Emperor's Champion model, but it's, I don't know, just doesn't seem that different from one that you could have converted up yourself. It's got an interesting kind of greaves as well, where the knee joint is part of the actual greave leg part, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah. They've moved away from the typical Primaris legs, and they've given him something quite bespoke.
I think it's more like Mark II Crusade armor had that kind of style where it was like all one big piece. So I think it's a bit more like that.
I think as well, I mean, the other things that you should notice is that his vambraces, the arm bit, arm bit, what is this bit called? The gauntlet, sorry, gauntlet. The gauntlets of his power armor are more akin to the older styles of power armor, so he doesn't have the Primaris displays, and he doesn't have all of the digital feeds and scanners and buttons that you associate with the standard Primaris minis. which is a really nice touch as well. You know, there's a lot of really nice little subtle things about this miniature that sort of harken back to the idea of the knightly orders of the Black Templars and the kind of Crusader-esque kind of aesthetics, but also just the fact that there's lots of little nods to some of the more kind of archaic, more artisan elements of the armor. I don't know. It feels a little less. It feels a little bit more medieval, I suppose. Which
well, that's what Black Templars are all about, really. And it is very much in keeping with the original. So you know, it does what it says on the tin, basically.
And I think,
I do like a lot of the elements, like you know, the plain chest, for example. The Halo's pretty good, I would say. It's a bit weird. It feels a bit lifted off away from the helmet as opposed to the original and a lot of the others that you can get where it's like built into the helmet and tightly wrapped around. It's a bit more, I guess, Halo-esque. All the sort of flying ribbons look really great. I mean, it's amazingly well painted as well. So, you know, props to them. I think it's probably a classic case of the angle of the photos just not the best, and when you see it in person it'll look great.
I think it's going to be spectacular. I think this is the thing. I think if you put this next to that lieutenant that you referred to, I think there just wouldn't be a contest between the two of them. I think this guy will just be so much more imposing, so much more beautiful on the tabletop. I think the stature of the mini is really great. And again, people complaining about he's going to trip up over a tabard. He's a 20-ton Space Marine, for goodness sake. I mean, like, no, the tabard will tear and move out of his way. It's not like the idea of a Space Marine coming along going, the tabard. It's like, no, that's true. I mean, you know, these guys are getting shot with all sorts of like high velocity tremor rounds and things that should knock them on their bums. And they tend to wade through that without any issues. Could you imagine how hilarious it was of him, you know, having forgotten to tie his shoelaces or the equivalent of, and just tripping up as he's trying to walk along?
It's an interesting one. How does he use his pistol?
How does he use his pistol?
Yeah, so his pistol's positioned on his left, which I assume he draws from his right hand. But his right hand is chained to a sword, which he can't holster. You can't put it away anywhere. You don't holster a sword. Sorry, God, I can't even remember what the term is. But you put it away in a sheath. You sheath your sword. But instead, he would have to grab his pistol, and the sword would have to just sort of dangle down from his wrist like a very large, piece of jewelry.
Yes. I think, Phil, when we get into situations where we're debating how an 8-foot tall super soldier clad from head to toe in reinforced power armor, wielding a sword the size of a bungalow, I mean, okay, yeah, I agree. Like there is some illogical posing and some more logical positioning of the pistol. They definitely got that right in the old mini, where obviously it was where the free arm was, and it made sense. But then, I think
even then, so that's done on the right, but it's still what looks like a right-handed holster. So he would have drawn it kind of quick draw style. But
that's true. But I suppose the old one,
I can't tell if in the old one, it doesn't look like his sword was actually chained to his.
It wrist. Wasn't, no.
So that's the sort of little addition. It's nice that he's got a piece of weapon chained to him, because that's historically what Black Templars would have. So it does make sense. I think what's also exciting, and I don't know if this is actually true or not, I assume there's going to be a bunch of gorgeous transfers coming based on what is on this model. And what they've put on they're not quite purity seals because they're sort of pinned on ribbons. But if all of those things that are on like the heraldry on the shield and stuff and on different bits of his armor are all transfers, that'd be pretty nice to have.
But long story short, Phil, I love this mini. I'm in the camp of, I think it's bloody great. And you know what? Take the pistol off him. I don't care. He don't need it. He's running around, smashing up the place with a big old sword. He'll have a great time.
It looks like the pistol can be glued on as a separate piece, so I imagine you could take it off if you want. I mean, it's not bad. It's like I don't want to say I wasn't blown away, but I think it's just a solid, B+.
I mean, it's another
B+
Space
mini.
Marine, right?
It's cool.
It's difficult to get overly excited about more Space Marines.
I don't know if you're a Space Marine player or Black Templars player, because I think what this is exciting about is this is heralding in the release of the Black Templars range that they've kind of talked and teased about, and obviously it is quite a cool quality mini. I can't wait to see the rest. Really, I think
this is the second Primara Space Marine to have an old school helmet. Can you remember the first one?
Well, this helmet just made me go, "Oh, it's like a Blade Guard helmet."
Well, no, it's not a Blade Guard helmet. It's specifically the one of the, I forget which mark it is, but it's the Black Templar style helmet. The Blade Guard helmet. Forgive me, I'm gonna have to very quickly check my work
because it's
here.
Similar style to the Grey Knights helmets, isn't it?
Yes. So the Blade Guard helmet is different because the Blade Guard helmet is kind of like it's got the helmet over the head, but it's actually got like a full face visor that kind of comes up. So it's almost like an Optimus Prime type situation, where the face visor comes up over the top of it. And you saw that exhibited with the way that the helmet would work with like the captain, that you could kind of pull up the top of the visor to expose the underneath. That, by all accounts, is a fairly unique helmet design. Although, to be fair, I believe a similar helmet was available on the tank commander. Sergeant Kronos had a very similar kind of design to his helmet, where he had visor panel thing that went over his mouth. But
is the other Primaris helmets that you're alluding to the bodyguards for the Ultramarines, the Honor Guard?
Okay, fine. Well, actually, you've just reminded me. Okay, a third one. It's 1 of 3. You've well done. That one you've remembered, obviously.
Ooh, okay. Another one.
Exactly.
Here's the thing: it's surely not a standard Primaris kit, right? Is it chapter specific?
No, yeah, it is.
I'm going to guess it's something Dark Angels.
No, it's Raven Guard. It's old Shrike from the Raven Guard.
Oh right, yes, with the
he has the beaky helmet on his admittedly he isn't wearing it, but he's got it on his He's got it on his. On his
well, actually, it's not just him, because you get it in the upgrade kit as well.
Oh, really? Did you get it in the Raven Guard upgrade kit?
Yeah, Raven Guard upgrade kit. You get it there as well.
Well, there you go. So there are a few old school helmets doing the rounds. That reminds me, Phil, you need to get me the bloody transfers from that kit.
Which one in particular? The Raven Guard one?
All of them. I need Iron Hands. I need Raven Guard. You said you had both.
Oh yeah, I think I've got some of each. Next time we hang out,
exactly whenever that may be.
I know. We need to get some games in soon, actually.
Exactly. Come on over. Why don't you come over this weekend?
Because I've got a friend coming over this weekend.
Oh, I see. A better friend than me. I get it.
Yes.
It's like, Dan, I talk to you every week. I'm done with this. You're creating awkward situations where you're making me talk about Patreons before I'm ready to discuss them. Why are you doing this to me?
Yes.
Yeah. But there we go. Anyway. And yeah, for next year, though, I feel like, knowing what my schedule will become in 2022, I kind of feel like I want to go back to fortnightly, for better or worse. So let us know what you think about that. You're going to be all right with us going fortnightly? Because we might have to. But, I'll try not to. If I don't have to, I won't. But, it's all about the long-term thing. Phil wants to stay weekly, don't you, Phil?
I do, yeah. So blame Dan. If it
Well, we haven't
happens.
made the decision yet. You know, this is, you know.
Get a change.org petition set up, everyone. Hashtag blame Dan.
Blame Dan, dear God. It's thanks to me that this is even here. You know, I built the BBC. I'm Henry Sellers. Don't know if anyone will out.
Scrooge McDuck coming out again.
That's it. No, that was a Father Ted reference that I'm sure no one got. Anyway, look, that'll do, won't it, Phil? We've talked for 40 minutes. That's the outro. Well, maybe not 40 minutes once I've chopped out some stuff. But yeah, we talked for a bit, so I reckon that'll do. Unless there's other things you want to talk about. We want to do justice to your Thunder Warriors with their own segment in a future episode, really.
Well, thanks very much. Maybe 100th episode we'll do a hobby-focused one, because we certainly won't want to do a back-to-back Codex episodes, will we?
No.
We've got better things to do on 100th.
100.
Yeah.
Phil, by the way, we need to put out a poll to ask people of the two which one they want us to do first.
Do we? So 1,000 Suns or Grey Knights?
1,000 Suns or Grey Knights. Which one will episode 99 be?
Oh,
'Cause
right, okay.
I can't decide.
I would personally go Grey Knights, because I think they're the more interesting of the two.
See, I would go 1,000 Suns because I like 1,000 Suns.
I like Grey Knights. So let's have a fight, and we'll see who wins.
Exactly, and whichever of our selected factions wins, we assume off the back of that they like us best.
Yes, vote Dan for 1,000 Suns, boo, or vote Phil for Grey Knights, yay!
There we go. But until next time, guys, goodbye!
Bye-bye!